The mysterious curse of donuts. Moving into a new house is always unsettling. John and his wife, Lisa, had just moved into an old house next to an abandoned Dunkin' Donuts, left in ruins nearly a decade ago. They had no idea the house harbored such a dark history. The fire had destroyed the building, leaving behind charred ruins and rumors of hauntings, which gave the area an eerie reputation. However, they never believed in such tales. At first, they enjoyed their new home and gradually adjusted to the quiet neighborhood. However, things quickly turned strange when a mysterious box of donuts began appearing on their doorstep every morning. It was a plain cardboard box, unmarked and without any notes, containing a dozen perfectly arranged donuts. John was suspicious, thinking it was some kind of prank, but Lisa, on the other hand, was delighted. She loved sweets, especially donuts. He brought the box inside, and Lisa eagerly opened it.
Look, they're fresh,
she exclaimed. He frowned.
I don't know. This seems a little strange.
John felt uneasy trusting food from strangers. Despite Lisa's claims that he was overreacting, John threw the donuts away. He didn't want to take any risks, but the next morning, it was back. Another box of donuts. He threw it away again, but the pattern continued. A few days later, a new neighbor moved in and brought them a box of donuts as a gift. John's instincts told him something was off, given the recent events. He gave a weak smile, took it inside, and threw it away. But one day when John came home, he found her eating a donut from the box. She dismissed his concerns with a weak laugh, saying,
it's just a donut.
That night, however, things took a disturbing turn. John woke to the sound of 3 knocks on the window, followed by 2 more. Then it intensified as he heard footsteps in the hallway and a strange bell ringing. It was a soft chime, like a hotel bell ringing. When John asked Lisa if she heard it, she mumbled in her sleep, turning her back to him. Over the next few days, the noises became more frequent. The knocks, footsteps, and bells. They felt like they were living in a nightmare. Lisa began acting strangely, growing distant and staring at the wall. One night, John found her standing completely still in the kitchen.
Lisa, what are you doing?
He asked, but she didn't reply. Suddenly, the same bell rang, and before he could react, she turned to him with a vacant stare and lunged at him with a knife in her hand. John narrowly dodged the knife, staggering backward. He escaped death by a hair's breadth, but Lisa's behavior grew increasingly erratic. Then she charged at him, as though possessed by madness. She began chasing John through the house, as if something was controlling her every move. However, as John reached the front door and flung it open, Lisa suddenly stopped. Her head jerked to one side, her neck twisting unnaturally as she stared at the abandoned Dunkin' Donuts building.
Lisa?
John called out, desperate.
What's happening to you?
But she didn't reply. She just began walking toward the ruins, her steps slow and deliberate. John followed her, keeping a safe distance. The neighbors began stepping out of their homes, drawn by the commotion. An elderly man approached John, his face pale and filled with confusion. He warned John that the building had a dark history. It had burned down 10 years ago, killing 6 people inside. He said, rumors claimed the place was cursed, though no one knew the full story. John looked at Lisa, who continued walking toward the burned ruins, oblivious to everything around her. The entrance was nothing but rubble and charred remains. She stepped inside and headed straight for the old counter. Fearful, John followed her, unable to leave her alone. Lisa bent down and picked something up from the debris. It was a tarnished desk bell, identical to the one John had heard in their house. Lisa placed it on an old countertop and began ringing it repeatedly, as if entranced. The sound echoed through the ruined building, sending a chilling wave through him. Not knowing what else to do, he shakily called the police. When the police arrived, Lisa was still standing there, her face void of expression. Ringing the bell like a madwoman, they sedated her and took her away. They admitted her to a mental health facility, but she hasn't responded since. 2 years have passed, and Lisa still hasn't opened her eyes. John can't shake the feeling that the donuts somehow caused all of this. He wishes she had never eaten those donuts that escape your pursuer at Dunkin' Donuts. Isa worked the night shift at her uncle's Dunkin' Donuts, a small, quiet spot off a lonely highway, struggling with boredom as a violent storm raged outside. Her phone battery died, flickering before finally shutting off. With a sigh, she plugged it into the charger. The empty Dunkin' Donuts felt eerily quiet. Feeling sleepiness creeping in from the stillness of the night shift, Isa got up and headed to the back to make herself a cup of coffee. Trying to stay alert, Isa sat at the corner table, sipping her coffee. The sound of the storm seemed to press in from all directions, making her feel unusually uneasy in the empty store. Just as she took another sip, the power went out, plunging the store into darkness. The bell above the door rang, signaling someone had entered. Isa froze. She wasn't expecting anyone, especially during this storm. Blinking, she slowly moved toward the counter, the only light coming from a nearby candle. As Isa lifted the candle, the pale face of a woman emerged from the shadows. Her hair was disheveled, her pants torn in multiple places, and her shirt dotted with what looked like dried blood. Isa, horrified, exclaimed,
Oh my God, you scared me. What happened to you? Are you okay?
The woman's eyes were wide with fear, an expression haunted and desperate.
Please.
She gasped.
You have to help me. He's coming. If we don't move fast, he'll kill me.
Before Isa could respond, headlights swept across the window. A blue pickup truck pulled into the parking lot. The woman grabbed Isa's arm with surprising strength for someone so frail.
We need to hide. Now.
Isa led her to the storage room and locked the door. Chaos ensued as the front door of the store opened again, this time revealing a man in his 40s with cold, sharp eyes. Isa forced a smile, trying to stay calm and keep him from suspecting anything.
Good evening. Can I get you something?
The man didn't answer immediately, his eyes darting toward the back room, where the door was slightly ajar.
I'm looking for someone. A woman. She came in here, didn't she?
Isa shook her head and said it was just her there. Isa was on high alert. The man kept his hand fidgeting in his jacket pocket, as if ready to pull something out at any moment. He seemed unconvinced and stepped closer to the counter, his cold, calculating eyes fixed on her.
Are you sure?
Things felt wrong. Before Isa could respond, the backroom door burst open. The woman dashed out, holding a fire extinguisher.
Run!
She shouted as she sprayed water into his face, then unleashed a torrent of foam, forcing the man to stagger back, momentarily blinded. They grabbed a baseball bat from behind the counter and bolted out the back door into the raging storm, disappearing into the pitch-black night. Freezing, they ran toward the woods. The man wasn't far behind, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness as he shouted threats. Finally, they found an abandoned wooden cabin, dilapidated and isolated, its door hanging loosely on its hinges. They immediately began barricading the door with an old table.
What now?
Isa whispered. The woman pulled out a small knife from her pocket and told Isa that, if necessary, they would face him. She had been running from him for weeks and decided it was time to stop hiding. He arrived and began pounding on the door, trying to force his way in. Isa and the woman exchanged a look, bracing for whatever would happen next. He burst through the door. The woman charged at him, knocking him off balance. Isa, trembling but determined, swung the baseball bat hard at his head. He collapsed to the floor, dazed. The woman quickly grabbed a rope from the cabin and tied the man up while Isa used his phone to call the police. When the police arrived, they uncovered horrifying evidence in his truck, tools for murder and belongings from previous victims, women he had kidnapped and tortured. As the storm began to dissipate, it was finally over. They turned to each other and smiled. The Bloody Delivery. A quiet, secluded suburban neighborhood with winding streets and houses far apart. My name is Nick, and I'm just a pizza delivery guy trying to make a living. Tonight is cold and rainy, the kind of night where windshield wipers have to work overtime. I've been driving these streets for months now, delivering pizzas to people who barely acknowledge me. It's just a job, nothing special. But tonight, I stopped at the same old house. The house that always orders pizza at the strangest hours. It's so remote and isolated. It feels like it belongs to another universe. I've been here so many times I've lost count, but there's always been something off about it. I parked in front of the isolated house at the edge of town, stopping at the end of the gravel driveway, headlights illuminating the crumbling porch. The house looked like it hadn't been cared for in years. Overgrown grass, dusty windows, darkened by old curtains swaying in the wind. I took a deep breath, grabbed the pizza box, and stepped up to the front door, knocking on the heavy wooden frame that echoed loudly. For a moment, nothing. Then, the door creaked open. A woman stood there, her faint smile barely lighting up her pale face, illuminated by dim light from inside. Yet her eyes were distant, unfocused, shadowed. "Here's your pizza," I said cheerfully, trying to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. She reached out for the pizza box, her hand extending. But something about her hand caught my eye. As I handed it to her, I noticed bruises, dark, swollen marks on her pale skin, as if they'd been there for days. I froze for a second, standing there, unsure if I should say something, but decided against it. I quickly withdrew my hand and forced a smile. "Thanks," she mumbled, almost robotic, before pulling the pizza box inside and shutting the door. I got back in my car and sat for a moment, thinking. The rain kept pouring, and the world outside felt heavy. I couldn't shake the image of her trembling hand as she took the pizza box from me. But I drove away, trying to push it out of my mind. It was just a strange coincidence, I told myself. Weeks passed. Same routine. I delivered pizza to the same house every few days. I started to feel uneasy, my curiosity growing. One evening, after handing her the pizza, I hesitated and asked, "Excuse me? May I ask something?" But the woman only smiled faintly, shook her head, and closed the door, leaving me unsettled. Each time, the bruises and scratches on her hands seemed worse, this time even on her face, as if they had just healed and then reappeared. My instincts told me something was very wrong. Tonight, there was no regular order, but then I noticed something strange, a note hastily written in black ink, taped to the door. It read, "Deliver to the back door. Knock 3 times, hard." I followed the instructions. This time, it wasn't her but a man. He stood there, bloodshot eyes, clearly intoxicated, his breath reeking of alcohol. He didn't say a word, just glared at me. I instinctively stepped back, trying to keep calm. He reached for the pizza box, snatched it from my hands, stepped inside and slammed the door shut. I left quickly. One evening, I drove past the house again, not to deliver this time, just passing by after my shift. My curiosity got the better of me, and I glanced at the house. In the second-floor window, a figure appeared behind the curtain, flashing a light 3 times, repeatedly, over and over. But then, I saw the shadow of a man behind her, raising his hand as if ready to strike. I froze for a moment, I sat in my car, unable to take my eyes off the house. Something inside me told me I needed to go back. I didn't know what would happen next, but I couldn't ignore it. She needed help. After some thought, I returned to the house, planning to make up an excuse, saying it was a promotional gift for loyal customers. I felt I needed to see the woman again to make sure she was okay. The woman opened the door to pay, her eyes darting down to her hand as if she was deciding whether to say something. I followed her gaze. Then, her hand slowly moved down in an unusual way. She folded her thumb into her palm, then folded all her fingers down. At first, I didn't understand, but then I remembered learning about warning signals. It was the SOS hand signal for help. Before I could react or ask her what was happening, the man appeared behind her and shoved her back. He was still drunk, stumbling toward me with a dark, menacing expression. This time, his face had a fresh scratch, and his clothes were smeared with something unidentifiable, speckled with tiny dark spots. The man looked disoriented, his bloodshot eyes moving sluggishly. He mumbled something incoherent and slammed the door shut. At that moment, I froze in hesitation, unsure if this was my responsibility and whether I was putting myself in danger. Just as I was about to leave, the woman screamed from inside the house. "Help! Please!" Her voice was filled with fear. I dropped the pizza box, instincts kicking in, and rushed through the door without hesitation, quickly moving into the house. I knew a bit about self-defense. I had trained in martial arts for situations like this. As I stepped inside, a scene of chaos unfolded. It was horrifying. She was pinned to the floor, struggling under the man's weight, her face wet with tears, and her hands partially bound. Before I could move, the man charged at me in a fit of rage. But I anticipated the attack, ducked low, and countered with a strong strike to his side, sending him crashing to the floor in pain. Seizing the moment, I pinned him to the floor and used the rope he was tying the woman with to restrain him temporarily, long enough to keep him away from her. He was arrested shortly after, and the truth behind that house came to light. Her name was Angela. The man was her ex-husband. The two had gone through a court-ordered divorce. After she refused to reconcile with him, he kidnapped and tortured her, planning to force her into submission. His recent behavior was the result of a psychotic episode. His obsession turned deadly when she tried to escape. After the incident, I decided to quit my job, unwilling to continue such a dangerous line of work. Angela is now living a happy life with her daughter and her new husband. Mystery buried under the snow. Rian had never truly clicked with Tyler, but they were still friends. Their relationship had always been complicated, marked by their differences in personality. Tyler was a complex, reserved guy with hidden corners of his life he never let anyone see. On the other hand, his mother, Diane, was the opposite, controlling, invasive, and suffocating. She seemed like a constant weight on his shoulders, though Tyler never outright said so. Their mother-son relationship might seem normal at first, but something about it never truly felt right. Diane constantly monitored Tyler with endless calls, texts, and surprise visits. He was never truly at ease during outings with friends, always explaining that he couldn't stay long because his mother would worry. When Tyler finally moved out, Rian thought things would change for him. Diane paid his rent, of course, so she couldn't entirely let go, but Tyler initially seemed more at ease. But that didn't last. He started avoiding people, skipping gatherings, and dodging calls. Rian thought Tyler was just adjusting to his new life, but one day, Rian ran into him. Tyler, looking exhausted, waved him over and asked for help fixing a leaking faucet. When Rian entered Tyler's apartment, everything seemed normal at first. However, There was an unsettling heaviness in the air. He noticed the backyard through the kitchen window was unusually dark. At first, Rian thought it was someone in the yard, but upon closer inspection, he realized it was a massive snowman. Rian frowned, jokingly pointing at it.
Who makes a snowman that big?
Tyler didn't reply, merely gesturing for him to focus on the faucet. Rian stepped into the kitchen, scanning the area for the faucet. As he approached the sink, something caught his attention. Tiny blood-red spots on the floor near the sink, scattered unevenly. At first, he thought Tyler had cut himself while cooking or something similar. That's not unusual for someone as clumsy as him. At first, they weren't clear, but upon closer inspection, something seemed off. The stains weren't random. They seemed to form a trail leading out to the yard. His brows furrowed in confusion, but he didn't react immediately. Tyler stood nearby, distant, as if lost in thought, staring blankly at the TV. As Rian knelt down to continue inspecting the faucet, something faintly glinted under the sink, catching his attention. It was a shiny keychain, stained with dried blood. Rian's hand trembled slightly as he picked it up, immediately recognizing it. It belonged to Diane, Tyler's mother, the one she always carried with her. Panic set in as he realized something was wrong. At that moment, Rian turned and saw Tyler, even though he'd heard him in the living room just seconds earlier, seemingly watching TV. His expression was blank, and he seemed unfocused.
Why is there blood on this? What's going on?
Tyler stayed silent, his gaze distant, as if calculating something. Before Rian could react, Tyler reached across the table and grabbed a kitchen knife. His movements were slow but deliberate.
You're not allowed to leave.
Tyler lunged at Rian with the knife. Instinctively, Rian stepped back but tripped over a chair, falling to the floor. Tyler raised the knife again, stepping forward with clumsy but determined strides. Rian raised his hands to defend himself, bracing for the worst. Tyler aimed for Rian's chest. Rian twisted on the ground, narrowly avoiding the blade. Tyler staggered, and that's when Rian noticed it. The keychain was still in his hand.
Wait, Tyler, calm down.
Rian shouted, but Tyler lunged again. In a desperate move, Rian stabbed Tyler's leg with the blood-stained keychain. Tyler screamed in pain, stumbling back as he looked down at his leg. Rian seized the opportunity to get up and run toward the back door. He stumbled into the giant snowman. The impact caused it to collapse, revealing a horrifying sight beneath, a pale, trembling hand. And then the fingers twitched. It was Diane.
Help.
She whispered weakly. She clung to his coat, her eyes filled with tears.
I wanted him to be happy.
Rian dragged Diane toward the patio, his arms trembling with the effort. Rian turned to see Tyler, now staggering and disoriented, looking toward them. His knees buckled, and he collapsed into the snow, sobbing uncontrollably.
I just wanted to fix everything.
The sound of sirens tore through the night as the police arrived. Tyler didn't resist as they surrounded him. He just sat there, his head in his hands, mumbling incoherently. The investigation revealed Tyler's mental breakdown. In a twisted effort to conceal his mother, he had hidden Diane inside the snowman. Tyler was sentenced to life in a mental institution, his mind damaged beyond repair. The snowman was something Rian could never forget, the desperation of Tyler and the suffering of Diane. In the freezing cold of winter, he could never look at a snowman the same way again. The eccentric person on the bus. The cold and quiet night in a small town. Bella often took the bus to get to her workplace. Every day, Bella waited at the same bus stop, quietly watching the world pass by while sipping her coffee. One evening, as usual, she waited for the bus to return home. But there was a man who caught her attention, sending a slight chill down her spine. A man in his 30s, disheveled hair, unshaven, boarded the bus after her. He sat a few rows behind her, but she could feel his eyes on her, though she didn't dare turn around. There was something strange about his presence. Every day on the bus, that man reappeared, always boarding right after her, and his strange behavior began. At first, he walked by and left behind a crude and eerie doll, saying, "This is for you," a gift, before quickly walking away. Bella found it odd and didn't pick it up, ignoring it and moving to another spot out of fear. Sometimes, he would mumble to himself in faint, incomprehensible whispers. Bella grew increasingly uncomfortable, but brushed it off, chalking it up to just an eccentric man. After all, he was just another bus passenger. As days passed without seeing him, she began to feel relieved, thinking she might have overreacted. One evening, Bella sat in her usual spot near the back of the bus. As the bus passed a stop, she saw a familiar figure. She froze, unable to believe her eyes. Then he boarded the bus. She avoided looking at him, pretending not to notice. She sighed in relief as he walked past, but her relief didn't last long as he doubled back and sat right next to her, despite plenty of empty seats around. She didn't dare move. He didn't look directly at Bella, but occasionally glanced at her from the corner of his eye. Then, suddenly, he turned his head toward her, locking eyes with her for a brief moment. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and hollow, sending chills down Bella's spine. At the next stop, he said nothing, simply placed a small piece of paper in her hand and got off the bus immediately, leaving her stunned. Throughout the ride, I didn't dare to open it. When I finally did, curiosity got the better of me. The note read, "I will follow you." Bella's heart raced as she hastily got off the bus. Bella hurriedly stepped off the bus and started walking faster, but then she heard footsteps behind her. When she turned around, no one was there. As soon as she entered her room, she locked all the doors and pulled the curtains tight, trying to shake the feeling of being watched. But then, from the window, she saw his figure lurking at the edge of the road, watching her. She couldn't tell if it was real or just her imagination driven by fear. The next day, Bella took a different route to work, avoiding buses entirely. But paranoia crept in. She began to feel like someone resembling the man from the bus was watching her from alleys, observing her from afar. Then the nightmare struck. A cold hand grabbed her wrist. Startled, she turned around in shock to see him, the man who had been following her from the bus. He gripped her tightly and said in a chilling voice, "You don't need to be scared. I just want to make sure you're safe." Bella was too terrified to think, only desperate to escape. She screamed, "Let me go," but it didn't change anything. His eyes were locked onto hers, unblinking. Luckily, Bella had prepared for the worst. She pulled a can of pepper spray from her pocket and sprayed it into his face, leaving him writhing in pain and temporarily blinded. Terrified, she ran without looking back and collapsed at a small roadside diner nearby, seeking help. He was apprehended shortly after being reported. He confessed that his obsession with Bella stemmed from her uncanny resemblance to his late girlfriend, who had died in a bus accident he couldn't prevent. He was diagnosed with PTSD, and seeing Bella on the bus had triggered his obsession. The man was later admitted to a facility for treatment. Bella, though still haunted by the events, found solace in knowing that the man wasn't truly a threat, but a broken soul lost in his past. But after all, everything had finally come to an end. The strange man in the snow. Last winter, I went to a small cabin owned by my uncle in Mountain Valley. I finally reached the cabin after a long 3-hour drive, the tires crunching on the frozen ground. Stepping out of the car, the cold bit through my coat. Almost immediately, a boy around 15 or 16 years old ran out of the cabin. He was young and smiling. His eyes looked tired, as though he hadn't slept in days. He took my luggage and guided me inside. I stepped inside the cabin. It was simple and rustic. A fireplace stood in the corner, with wood neatly stacked beside it. The boy explained how cold it got at night, his voice unusually calm. I told the boy I would go skiing and asked if he could prepare dinner for me while I was out. He nodded with that strange smile. I dressed in my ski gear, excited to hit the slopes. I began skiing through the forest, where all the trees were bare. Halfway down, snow started falling, thick and fast. I took a break and walked toward a large tree. Suddenly, a faint growl echoed in the air. I froze. Standing next to the tree was a man looking up at the sky, his face covered in falling snowflakes. His neck was unnaturally long, and his shoulders jutted out at odd angles. He didn't move at all. This man was unsettling. I quietly stepped back, avoiding sudden movements so as not to disturb him. I just wanted to get back to the cabin. I stepped cautiously, but accidentally crushed a twig underfoot. A loud snap broke the silence. The man looked down, his eyes glowing like those of a wild animal. Blood was smeared across his mouth, and his right hand clutched a dead rabbit, its belly torn open. The man wiped his mouth with his other hand and smiled wickedly. Panicked and frantic, I bolted through the forest, snow crunching under my boots. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know if he was following. I burst through the cabin door, slamming it shut behind me. I quickly locked it. The teenager noticed something was wrong. He came out of the kitchen, and I shouted to call the police immediately. He calmly replied, "There's no service here, sir." I checked my phone, and he was right. There was no signal. "What's going on, sir?" the boy asked. I realized I couldn't tell the boy the truth about the man. I didn't want to scare him. So, I lied and said I had heard wild animals in the forest. After a while, I calmed down, embarrassed by my overreaction. Perhaps I had exaggerated it too much. While having dinner, the lights suddenly went out. A heavy snowstorm had started outside, and I could hear the windows rattling from the fierce wind. I wondered where the boy was and realized I never knew his name. Suddenly, I heard footsteps crunching on the snow outside. I slowly turned my head toward the large window. Near the fireplace, the light illuminated a bloodied hand pressed against the outside of the living room window. His bloodied hand was pressed against the glass. It was the man I had seen in the forest. His face was pressed against it, smearing blood across the surface as he grinned, staring directly at me. The man's mouth gaped open, his tongue licking blood around his lips. His unblinking eyes were fixed on me. Then the boy walked in, as if he had been hiding, and looked at the man through the glass. He wasn't scared. He was almost amused. His smile mirrored the man's grin. "That's my father," he said. I froze for a moment, then grabbed the car keys off the wall. I flung open the front door and ran barefoot into the storm. I didn't care. I just wanted to get away from the cabin. The boy's laughter followed me into the night. I hurried to the car, driving for 2 hours, barely able to see through the snowstorm. I didn't stop until I reached the next hotel. Once I was safe, I called my uncle. His answer sent chills down my spine. "What boy? There's no caretaker at the cabin. No one else is supposed to be there." Horrified, I realized I had spent hours in that cabin with complete strangers. The next morning, I reported it to the police. They went with me to the cabin. It was empty. My belongings were gone, and the cabin was spotless, as if no one had ever been there. A chill ran down my spine. I didn't know what those people wanted, but I would never stay in an isolated cabin again. The strangers in the elevator. It was late. and the tall apartment building loomed against the foggy sky, its dim lights flickering in the mist. The street was quiet and empty, except for the occasional sound of distant traffic. I want to take a walk to enjoy the fresh air a bit. As I walked towards the elevator, the air suddenly became cold, making me shiver. The sliding doors opened. I stepped inside and pressed the button for the first floor. The elevator began descending, but suddenly, it stopped at the 6th floor. The sliding doors opened with a faint creak, and a woman was standing there. She was thin, her cheeks hollow, and her messy hair hung down over her face. Dark circles surrounded her lifeless eyes. A sense of unease crept over me as I noticed she was barefoot. She stepped inside, clutching her stomach as if in pain. Her head remained bowed, her movements slow and deliberate. I shifted uncomfortably, but something about her appearance left me confused and uneasy. Her dress was dirty, and she looked like she might be homeless. Her gaze remained fixed on the elevator floor, even though there was nothing there. When the elevator reached the 1st floor, I hurried out without even looking back. I quickly left the building. A little while later, I returned to the building, brushing off my thoughts, and stepped inside. As I pressed the button for the 8th floor, the elevator began to rise, but stopped again at the 6th floor. The elevator doors opened, and a horrifying sight greeted me. She was standing there, and I froze. Then, she began crawling frantically toward me. Panicking, I quickly pressed the close button, just in time before she could reach me, and the elevator doors shut. The next day, as I approached the elevator, a sense of anxiety washed over me. The elevator descended, stopping once again at the 6th floor. The sliding doors opened, and this time, it was a man. He was barefoot, just like the woman. I began to whisper, "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The man turned to look at me, his face showing pain, mumbling and then saying,
"I've lost something. My stomach hurts so much."
Then he collapsed onto the floor, his hands searching the ground for something I couldn't see. Everything felt eerie and terrifying. When the doors opened, I bolted out of the elevator immediately, my whole body trembling with fear. I went to the management office, but they said no such person existed. Still unsettled, I went to the mailroom to pick up some things, and that's when I began to piece things together. When I opened my mailbox, one thing caught my eye: the maintenance bill for the 6th floor. 2 apartments were listed, 601 and 602, along with the water bill. Oddly, I noticed 602's water bill was abnormally high. A few nights later, I returned to my apartment after working late. When the elevator doors slid open, a large man was holding a long, heavy golf bag. It had a strange smell, a faint metallic tang wafting through the air. I glanced at the elevator control panel. The 6th floor button was lit. When the doors opened on the 6th floor, he stepped out, carrying the bag into the dark hallway toward apartment 602. I glanced down and saw tiny drops of something dark, like blood, on the floor. What was he carrying? Back in my apartment, I couldn't sit still. Finally, I picked up my phone and called the police. The police entered the building, heading straight for the 6th floor, to apartment 602. Inside apartment 602, they found a makeshift surgical room. Blood was everywhere. They also found a freezer and the suspicious golf bag. Inside were corpses. Their organs had been removed. The police uncovered evidence of organ trafficking taking place right in my building. At that moment, I asked them about the barefoot man and woman I had encountered in the elevator, but they said there was no one like that in the building as I described. I requested to see the elevator surveillance footage. When the video played, I saw myself in the elevator, but I was alone and talking to no one. I was frozen in shock. 3 days later, I received the final report from the police. The victims found were all homeless people. Those I encountered might have been spirit souls of those taken by the traffickers. still searching for something, perhaps pieces of their own bodies. Echoes from the haunted shop. It all began as a challenge. Every town has one, a haunted location that no one dares to enter after dark. For their city, it was an old fast food restaurant that had closed down years ago after a string of mysterious deaths. Now, it stood there, decaying at the corner of the street. For years, stories surrounded the place. Customers disappeared, strange noises echoed at night, and lights flickered inside despite no power. Some even claimed the place was cursed. The building loomed before them, weeds sprouting through cracks in the sidewalk, and an old, rusty delivery truck sat in a distant corner. The neon sign had long since died, but somehow, even in its decay, it emitted an eerie glow under the moonlight. They approached the door, and James pushed it open without hesitation. It creaked loudly, the sound echoing through the empty space inside. A foul odor immediately assaulted their noses, a rotten mixture of mold and something much worse, something decaying. But as she stepped inside, Sarah felt a chill seep into her bones. Her eyes darted around, wide with anticipation. Inside, the scene was worse than expected. It looked frozen in time, as if everyone had left one day and never returned. Dust covered the wrapping counter and old trays lay scattered on the floor. Then, a flickering light appeared at the back, something that shouldn't have been on. As there was no power here, they moved toward the kitchen, where most of the rumors originated. They said a corpse had been found here. As they approached the kitchen door, the overhead light flickered again, casting long, distorted shadows on the wall. James gave a nervous smile. The kitchen was a mess. Rusty appliances were caked with grease. The tiled floor was cracked, and dark stains splattered the walls. They began to hear whispering growing louder, coming from the old cold storage room at the back of the kitchen. Sarah stepped closer and peered inside. Something caught her attention, a reflection. At the back of the cold storage room, behind the shelves, was a mirror. The strange thing was they had never seen a mirror inside a cold storage before. And in the reflection were the two of them. But there was another dark shadow standing right behind Sarah and James. She turned around abruptly, but the room was empty. But in the mirror, they could both see her. A woman. She stood just a few feet away, her sunken eyes and skeletal face staring at them hungrily. In fear, they turned to leave, but the cold storage door slammed shut with a deafening noise. Darkness seemed to engulf them. She didn't dare look back, feeling a chilling presence as if she were right there behind her. Sarah fumbled for her phone, desperately seeking light, and when she turned on the flashlight, everything only got worse. In the beam of light, Sarah saw her face. Her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. It was pale, eyes rolled back, emaciated, and her skin seemed to crack. Her bony fingers brushed against Sarah's skin. And then, suddenly, as quickly as it had started, she vanished. Before she could regain her composure, in the corner of the room, hidden among boxes and discarded trays, something caught Sarah's eye. She stopped, pointing with a trembling finger. It was a woman lying on the floor, her limbs twisted at unnatural angles. It was still decaying. She thought it couldn't be simple. Perhaps it was a murder. There was no time to think anymore. They hurriedly left the place. Sarah trembled. In a panic, she pulled out her phone to call 911. A while later, they arrived to cordon off and investigate the abandoned place. Then they heard an announcement from a detective. The woman they found matched the missing person they were searching for. Her family had reported her missing just 2 days prior. A chill ran down their spines as they heard his words. Realizing they had just encountered the victim of an unsolved case made the atmosphere feel heavy. Returning home, even now in the silence of the room, they sometimes heard whispers. They thought perhaps this wasn't a place to explore. There's always a reason why places like this have rumors, and they often stem from real dangers. The stalker in the forest. The sun barely peeked through the dense pine trees as I drove north, my truck loaded with skiing gear and camping supplies. This time, my friend Leo and I had planned a skiing trip in a remote area, miles away from any ski resort. After a few hours of driving, I parked my truck at the base of an area that looked decent with several hills, but I stopped there because I really couldn't drive any further due to the trees. Leo and I unloaded our gear, struggling to walk a quarter mile to a clearing where we set up camp. It was an incredible amount of work with all the stuff we had to carry. In a small clearing among the trees, we pitched the tent, laid out our sleeping bags, and organized our gear. After setting up camp, we began hiking up the hill, carrying our snowboards and keeping an eye on the steep slopes. The ascent was quite challenging, but I felt thrilled as we climbed higher. We snowboarded down several slopes, one after the other. But as I neared the bottom of a slope, I lost sight of Leo. I assumed we'd meet at the base or regroup at camp. It wasn't unusual for us to take different paths down the hill. I called him on the radio, but all I got was static. Maybe he was still skiing and had started down alone. My eyes scanned the trees for any sign of him. When I reached the base of the hill, I walked and spotted another figure emerging from the woods. A skier, wearing a mask and dressed in layers. He approached me, seeming friendly beneath the ski mask, asking where the best hills were and if we were camping. He explained that he and his wife were looking for a good place to camp near others and asked if I could lead him to my campsite, though I really didn't want to. I pulled out the radio again, calling Leo to let him know I would be heading back to camp soon. The device crackled, a distorted noise cutting in, but there was no response from him at all. Then the man started following me, his presence behind me making me feel uneasy. Suddenly, I started hearing static from the other end of the radio, as if someone was trying to talk to me but couldn't connect. When we finally reached the tent, something felt off. I realized I hadn't seen his wife, so I asked where she was. He didn't respond. Instead, he moved closer, his movements becoming increasingly strange. But for some reason, something about his snowboard and backpack caught my attention. They felt familiar. Gray, bright orange. The snowboards tightly strapped on either side. My mind raced as I remembered. Leo had the exact same ones. For a few seconds, I thought Leo was pranking me. But no, the voice was too different. He stepped within inches of me, revealing his real face and grinning maliciously. This was not Leo. Panic surged as I backed away, stumbling into the tent. I rifled through the backpack, my fingers fumbling for the flare gun. Just as I grasped it, the man grabbed my foot sticking out of the tent. Then I suddenly felt a sharp pain in my leg. A severe tingling sensation in my leg felt like a strong electric shock, burning, and I screamed in pain. I glanced down and saw a knife embedded deep in my thigh. A scream tore from me as I grabbed the flare gun. He stepped back, but I didn't lower the weapon. I aimed directly at him. Blood oozed from my wound, staining the snow beneath me. I demanded to know where my friend was. The man's voice was calm, almost mocking, as he told me Leo was lying near the foot of the slope where we had been skiing. His words sent chills down my spine. He turned and sauntered away, disappearing into the darkness of the woods before I could fire a shot. My vision blurred from the pain, but I pressed down on my leg, trying to staunch the bleeding while I grabbed my phone and called 911. Just as I began to lose hope, a distant noise reached my ears. A rescue helicopter illuminated the snow-covered hills. With the little strength I had left, I fired the flare gun, the red light bursting into the sky. I mustered all my strength to tell them about Leo. He was found lying motionless on the hillside, his face pale. Blood stained his pants and the snow beneath him. A few days later, we were both recovering in the hospital, our wounds stitched up, but the memories remained vivid. We learned that our attacker was wanted for multiple assaults in remote areas, always hunting those who wandered too far from safety. The curse of the doll. The sun was setting as Claw walked home alone. Suddenly, an elderly woman appeared, dressed in tattered clothes, approaching her. The woman approached Clara, extending her hand which held an old, creepy-looking doll. What was strange was that the doll's head was tilted at an odd, unnatural angle, with a deep crack running down its body. At first, Clara intended to walk past, but something compelled her to stop. She gave the woman a few coins, and the doll was pressed into her hands before the woman left immediately. Clara returned to her apartment, the doll in her hands. She felt a shiver run down her spine, but dismissed it as just the chill of the night air. As she unlocked the door and stepped inside, she was completely unaware of the faint, soft footsteps following her. Claw held the doll up. Its lifeless eyes stared blankly, as if looking right through her. An uneasy feeling washed over her as she grasped its broken body and placed it on a high shelf before turning away. That night, Claw lay in bed. She tried to sleep, slowly turning onto her side. And right there, beside her pillow, was the doll, its broken neck tilted to one side. Its eyes stared hauntingly at her. She snatched it up and tossed it aside. The next morning, before heading to work, Claw paid little mind to it. She picked it up, glanced at it for a moment, then temporarily set the doll on the sofa. However, when she returned that evening, she found the doll in an odd position. Unexplainably, it was sitting on her bed in her bedroom, even though Claw had closed the door beforehand. She was certain she had left it in the living room. Claw furrowed her brow, glancing around her apartment, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. But soon after, she began to notice that her doll seemed to be moving around the room. In the following days, these occurrences seemed to persist. She began to see sticky notes scattered throughout their apartment, with phrases like "hello" and "it's broken." These notes were written on leather paper, something they didn't even have in the house. One afternoon, while alone in the apartment, Claw heard a faint rustling sound, as if someone was moving inside. She froze, straining to listen. After a moment, she began searching the rooms but found no one. However, on the bedroom floor, she saw the doll lying face down, its neck broken at an odd angle. A sharp pain shot through her chest, and she glanced at her hand, horrified to see bloodied scratches. The streaks of blood ran down her palm, though she had no idea how they got there. She stared at the doll, feeling as though its lifeless eyes were mocking her. What she couldn't understand was that within 2 days, the scratches vanished as if they had never existed. That night, Clara lay in bed, nervous. She tried to close her eyes, but a faint whisper echoed throughout the room, growing louder and louder until she could clearly hear the words, "It's over." Suddenly, a pressure bore down on her, and her eyes flew open to find the doll just centimeters from her face. Its eyes locked onto hers. Claw gasped for breath. She sat up, but the doll had vanished. It remained on the shelf as if it had never moved. Days passed, and Claw became increasingly withdrawn, her face pale, eyes dim. The presence of the doll seemed to grow, draining her energy. In a final frenzy, Claw found a metal bin in a nearby alley and threw the doll into the fire. The fabric doll burned, and Claude looked away, believing it was all over, and went home. But when she returned, the doll, singed but seemingly unharmed, sat inexplicably in her room. She felt powerless and exhausted. She picked it up. Suddenly, she collapsed to the floor, a strange sensation washing over Claude, as if her soul was being pulled from her body, drained by the doll. The next morning, an old woman stood in an alley. In her hands, she tightly clutched the tilted doll. People passed by, avoiding looking, instinctively feeling uneasy before her presence. Then there was a girl whose expression was more curious than scared. Her eyes stared at the doll, a curious excitement flashing in her gaze. She walked over and held out the doll. "You seem to like it, don't you?" She held out her hand, almost reaching for it before she pushed it away like she always did. She was excited to have it. Letting go, she watched contentedly as her new victim clutched the doll, seemingly unaware of the curse. She was welcoming. As the young girl turned away, the old woman's eyes followed her. That's right. She was born to do this. The deadly farewell. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead as I walked through the sterile hallway of the hospital. I had worked here for years, the smell of antiseptic and the beeping of monitors ingrained in my senses. But lately, something felt different, something that always sent a chill down my spine. My patients came in all ages, but there was one little girl named Tira, perhaps the youngest patient in the hospital. Tira was a sweet child. She often wandered the halls and talked to other patients, though she was mostly alone. One night, while working a night shift, I was doing my rounds as usual. In the empty, long corridor, I heard two people talking softly. It was late, and all patients were supposed to be asleep. I followed the sound, which was coming from room 203. As I carefully opened the door to check, I saw her. Tira was standing near the patient's bed, smiling at me mysteriously and greeting me. But my sudden appearance didn't startle her at all. I reminded her that it was past bedtime and asked what she was doing there. She replied,
Nothing. I just came to say goodbye to George.
George was the patient in room 203. He had recently undergone major surgery. Though Tira seemed calm to me, I noticed George's face. He looked terrified and extremely pale. When I turned to remind her and take Tira back to her room, she had vanished as quickly as if she'd never been there. The next day, I went home around 4 a.m. after my night shift ended. It was my day off, so I slept the entire day. When I returned to work and walked past room 203, I thought about checking on George. But when I opened the door, I found a different patient, and I was informed that George had passed away the previous day. I stood frozen in the hallway, suddenly remembering when I asked Tira what she was doing in George's room. She said she came to say goodbye. But why goodbye? Shouldn't it have been good night? Something was very strange. Every time I encountered little Tira, I would find her wandering the empty hallways at night, talking to someone or entering a room. At first, I was skeptical, but I noticed that her presence seemed to coincide with the moments just before a patient passed away. Could she possess the strange ability to know when someone was about to die? Then I searched the hospital records. Tira wasn't listed anywhere. There was no information about her being admitted, and no legal guardianship papers on file. I was stunned. I gradually became obsessed with Tira's story and started investigating her background. My suspicions grew when I learned from a nurse that Tira had died in the hospital just a few months ago after falling down the stairs. However, the nurse insisted the incident was ruled an accident, and the hospital never made it public. My mind reeled. How could Tira still be here if she was dead? I started piecing things together, and a chilling thought struck me. Perhaps Tira's spirit was still lingering here, One day, when I dozed off at my desk, I saw her. She was sitting, crying in my dream. I slowly approached Tira. Tira turned to face me, her pale face and empty eyes brimming with a profound sadness. She said,
I've been waiting for you, Dr. Cooper. You're the only one who can help me.
I stood frozen, the air thick with fear, or perhaps confusion. I asked Tira,
Help you? Tell me how.
Tira's ghost stepped closer, her small hand reaching toward me. She whispered painfully,
The experiment. The experiment killed me.
I jolted awake at my desk, drenched in sweat from what I had seen. It was too real, like a cry for help. I knew I needed to act. I dug through old records, my hands trembling. I found it, just a copy, a part of a plan I'd never seen before. It all seemed to point to a dark secret. The deeper I delved into Tira's past, the more I realized her death was no accident. In reality, it was the result of an illegal medical experiment involving an unapproved drug to test the limits of human pain endurance and survival. Tira was selected as a test subject due to the influence of her adoptive father, a man working at the hospital as part of an underground network of unethical experiments. The drug used on Tira was untested and had horrifying side effects. Tira's death was the culmination of a cover-up to protect the hospital's reputation. One night, while working the night shift at the hospital, I heard strange noises, like a child crying, coming from the abandoned wing of the hospital. The sounds led me down a hallway that hadn't been used in years. My heart pounded as I pushed open a door, revealing a forgotten room. Tira stood there, her figure faint in the dim light, her eyes filled with sadness and pain. She told me that she couldn't leave, and that she had been trapped in the hospital ever since her death. Her spirit was tethered to the hospital, bound to the hallways, unable to move on until the truth about her death was revealed. Tira had guided other souls to the afterlife, but she herself was trapped here. When I made my final efforts to reveal the truth, the hospital management and the girl's adoptive father tried to discredit me, even going to great lengths to silence me by threatening my career. The hallways were empty, the hospital eerily silent. I walked through them, knowing they were trying to stop me. But I didn't falter, and I was determined to report everything to the authorities, ensuring that those responsible would be held accountable. As the authorities investigated, I stood in a patient's room, moonlight streaming through the window. I saw the silhouette of a little girl standing behind me. It was Tira, appearing now in a more peaceful form. She smiled, her eyes filled with gratitude. She thanked me, her voice gentle, as her figure began to fade away. Tira's departure finally brought clarity. The hospital faced public outrage, and the administration was forced to shut down. Her adoptive father was arrested for his involvement in the illegal experiments, and justice was served. Although Tira's ghost was gone, the darkness of the hospital remained, reminding me that the line between life and death, between justice and illegality, is often much thinner than we imagine. The ghost train on Christmas Day. It was Christmas Eve, and I was late for my flight. The snow was falling heavier than usual, and the slippery roads turned my usual route to the airport into a nightmare. I had to catch the last train out of town to make it to my flight. Otherwise, I'd be stuck until morning. I arrived at the station just in time to catch the train, which seemed unusually empty for such a busy night. It was an old model, not the kind of train I usually saw at this station. But I didn't have time to think about it. I hurried aboard. As I stepped onto the train, I noticed the conductor. He wasn't the usual friendly face I was accustomed to on my daily commutes. This man was older, gaunt, with tired eyes that made me uneasy. His uniform was dark and worn, as though it hadn't been cleaned in years. The inside of the train was just as strange. filled with the scent of old wood and something faintly musty lingering in the air. The train car was nearly empty, save for a few scattered passengers, but the atmosphere was tense, as if something wasn't quite right. I sat by the window, watching the snow fall heavier, blanketing everything outside. The train began to move, and I felt it sway slightly as it picked up speed out of the city. Then I heard the sound of a child crying, just a faint sob. At first, I thought I imagined it, but then it echoed faintly again, as if coming from somewhere near the back of the train. I tried to ignore it, but it echoed in my mind. I began to feel increasingly uneasy, glancing around again, but no one else seemed to notice the sound, which only made it worse. Then I saw him, the conductor. I asked him if he heard it. He said, "Not all passengers on this train want to be here, but they cannot leave." To my bewilderment, he walked away immediately. I steadied myself and turned to ask him about what he had just said. But strangely, he was no longer there. I stood up and walked toward the back of the train. My footsteps echoed in the silence. When I reached the next car, I froze in place. In the dim light, I could see a shadow. It was a child. He clutched a small, tattered doll in his hands, wearing what looked like outdated, shabby clothes. He didn't move, his head bowed. I asked, "Are you lost?" But there was no response. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the train lurched forward, shaking violently. Without thinking, I reached out to steady the boy. The lights stabilized, but the train car was empty, completely deserted. I moved back into the aisle, trying to understand what was happening. The other passengers remained still, staring straight ahead, oblivious to the madness unfolding around them. Suddenly, I felt a cold hand grasp my arm, sending a shiver through me. The train shook violently again, and the temperature plummeted. I could see my breath in the air. The train screeched to a sudden halt, and I stumbled, trying to steady myself. The passengers were gone. The train was empty, except for the boy, standing with his back to me. He didn't move, just stood there with his head slightly tilted, as if waiting for me to do something. The doll in the boy's hand fell to the floor. I slowly approached him, bending instinctively to pick it up. When I looked up, my breath caught in my throat. The boy turned, and his eyes were voids of pitch-black emptiness, locking onto mine. His voice echoed coldly in the air. "They left me." I panicked, never having seen anything like this before. Before I could react, the sound of crying turned into an ear-piercing scream, deafening and spine-chilling. I lost my balance and fell backward in fear, my vision spinning as the boy stood still, seemingly unaffected. The train doors suddenly slid open. With trembling hands, I crawled toward the exit, desperately trying to escape. I staggered out into the freezing, eerily silent night. But when I looked back, the train was gone, completely vanished, leaving only an empty, snow-covered platform as if it had never been there. I don't remember how I got home that night. Every Christmas Eve since, I still wonder whether the midnight train was real or just a nightmare. Years later, on another Christmas Eve, I found an old article, a newspaper archive about a train that disappeared in a snowstorm many years ago. The article spoke of a missing child whose parents had abandoned him on that very train. It was said that the Midnight Express appears every Christmas Eve, carrying lost souls who cannot move on. I closed my laptop, my hands trembling. I looked out the window. The snow continued to fall outside, and a chill ran down my spine. The woman disappeared in white clothes. I grew up hearing stories from my cousin, who worked at the local police station. He was the kind of person who had seen it all. But there's one story he told me that always sent chills down my spine, and it's true. This story is about the mysterious woman in white. It all started with a midnight call from a gas station attendant. My cousin's colleague, Officer Nathan, was working the night shift. The attendant claimed he had been robbed, and the thief fled before he called. A woman in a white dress with long black hair, incredibly beautiful. Strangely, the suspect wasn't a masked figure or some shady guy, but a woman. He explained that she had come to him, asking for help because she was lost in the middle of the night. He had gone to the office to notify his boss, but when they returned to the cash register, she was gone, and so was all the money. Nathan, the only officer on duty so late, immediately got in his patrol car and headed to the gas station. It was a deserted road, winding through the woods on the outskirts of town. As Nathan drove, his headlights caught movement up ahead. A dark shadow was slowly walking toward him. Walking alone in the opposite direction was a woman in a white dress. She matched the attendant's description exactly. He accidentally passed her by, but unsure if his eyes were deceiving him, he saw that she had no face as he drove by. Finding it too unbelievable, he slowed down and reversed to check if she was indeed the woman the gas station attendant had described. After reversing, he stopped and quickly stepped out of the car, saying, "You need to get in the car and come with me to the police station immediately." She said nothing and complied. On the drive back to the station, he asked her a few questions about why she had stolen the money. However, she didn't say a word. He looked through the rearview mirror as she sat in the back seat, staring intently at one spot until they arrived at the station. Her behavior was strange, so he thought the woman might have mental issues. After that, he decided not to ask her any more questions. When they got back to the station, they began interrogating her, but she still didn't speak. His shift was almost over, so he prepared to hand over the report to the incoming officers. Just before he was about to leave, she suddenly started talking. She gestured and spoke, promising to return the money the next day if they let her spend the night in the holding cell at the station. She kept insisting that she had nowhere to go, and the officers were quite confused by what she was saying, unsure of what to do. Nathan reported to his superiors. He was informed that they couldn't move her to another holding facility that day. So in the end, they agreed to her request and placed her in the holding cell. Before leaving, Nathan made a final call to the gas station, informing the attendant that they had caught the suspect. The money would be returned the next morning, or so they thought. The next morning, Nathan returned to the station. As he approached the woman's cell, he witnessed a horrifying scene. The cell was empty. The woman they had arrested the night before was gone, except for the crumpled body of a man, her cellmate. His face was shredded with deep scratches, his wide eyes frozen in terror, and his body was pinned to the wall with nails driven into the flesh. Scattered around him were bills, and a few banknotes that hadn't been found the day before were stuffed into his pockets. Worse still, scrawled in blood on the wall beside his body were the words, "I have paid the debt." Nathan frantically searched the area. Even more terrifying was that she had completely vanished. No one heard or saw anything. The cameras? They hadn't captured any footage of her entering or leaving the cell. She had disappeared without a trace. A thorough search was conducted. The surrounding area was combed, and every possible lead was followed. But the woman in white was never found. She simply vanished, like a ghost fading into the darkness. Even to this day, no one knows who or what she was, but the officers present that night remain haunted by the incident. That's the whole story my cousin told me. I sat and listened, and I could still see the fear in his eyes when he spoke about her. The question that always haunted me was how she managed to escape from the cell. Was she human, or something far worse? The strangest part is that she evaded all the surveillance cameras. After countless investigations, they still don't know what happened that night or where she went. The House of the Lost Child. It was 2006 when my family moved into this house. My parents decided to quit their jobs and start anew in the countryside. I was just a child then. But something about this house struck me immediately. The first thing I noticed when we moved in was the stairs. Every time I passed by, I would see a shadow silently moving up and down. It never frightened me. In fact, it felt oddly familiar. I was 6 years old, but I could always see things that others couldn't, and this house was no exception. I didn't tell my parents right away, not because I was scared, but because I felt that presence meant us no harm. Still, I was very afraid of the dark. My room was upstairs while the bathroom was downstairs. Every night, before going to bed, I would use the bathroom to avoid facing the fear of going down the stairs alone at night. But one night, my mother's voice woke me. She called out to me, angrily and irritably, telling me to come downstairs and not to run around anymore. I sat up in bed, confused. I hadn't run at all. In the following days, I kept experiencing similar incidents. My mother often scolded me for running around the house, accusing me of mischief. I had told her many times that I hadn't done it, but she never believed me. Then one night, the power went out, and we were almost engulfed in darkness, lit only by a few flickering candles in the living room. As we sat together, I saw it again, a shadow. It swayed back and forth, hovering over the sofa. My mother didn't see it, but I did. That presence was very strong but had no malice. That night, as we lay in bed, my mother and I heard a voice, soft yet clear as day.
Mom, where are you? I'm cold.
That voice belonged to a child, and it came from just outside our bedroom. My mother looked at me, eyes wide with fear. As I grew older, I began to understand that the shadow wasn't there to harm us. It wasn't a ghost trying to scare us, but a lost child searching for something. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that spirit was looking for its mother. I had a friend who could sense things like I could, and they suggested that I tell the spirit to move on. So one quiet afternoon, I stood in the living room and said to the air, "I believe your mother loves you very much. You can move on. It's time to go to a happier place." The house felt different afterward. The shadow disappeared. The footsteps stopped. No more voices at night. I thought that the spirit had finally found peace, or perhaps it needed to validate something because it had been left here and unable to move on in this house. In 2018, my aunt, Tita, who had worked abroad, returned home to retire. One evening, we sat together in the living room, sharing stories. We talked about the strange occurrences that had taken place in the house over the years. I told her about that spirit, about how my mother had once mistaken it for me because it looked like a small child. I explained how I had ultimately helped it move on. As I was speaking, I noticed something. Tita, she's crying. She started telling me a story I had never heard before. Long before I was born, my grandmother, she was pregnant with Aunt Tita. Not long after that, there was a baby boy. She named her son Angelo. Suddenly one day, Grandma left and didn't come back. At that time, Aunt and Angelo were too young to know what to do in this remote suburb. So, Angelo lay on the sofa. The boy was sick and passed away in his sleep while clutching a small glass jar that his mother had given him. He was only about 3 to 4 years old. At that time, my aunt was too young to understand what was happening and thought her brother was just sleeping until one day a neighbor came and took the boy to a small coffin and buried him. Our new house sits on this land. Perhaps the boy could not move on because he was waiting and didn't know when his mother would return. Sometime later, my aunt, the boy's sister, passed away just after we talked about him. Now, standing in front of the house, I can't shake the feeling that something has changed. Then came the unmistakable sound of soft footsteps. They echoed from the hallway behind me, moving toward the stairs. I turned around, breath caught in my throat. The shadow had returned. As I climbed the stairs, I saw the shadow standing right above and sliding into my bedroom. Upon reaching the room, I hesitated. My hand hovered over the doorknob, and just as I was about to turn it, I heard,
Mom, where are you?
I slowly pushed the door open, the creaking hinges filling the silent house. The room was bathed in the faint light of the moon filtering through the window, casting a cold glow over everything. My heart skipped a beat as I saw Angelo. This time, he was not just a shadow. He stood in the middle of the room, a small, frail figure, unmistakably a child. His head was bowed down. Then slowly, Angelo lifted his head, and for the first time, I saw his face. A face with deep-set eyes filled with sorrow. His mouth opened, and in a voice that sent chills down my spine, he whispered,
Mom, where is she?
I wanted to tell him, to explain that she had passed away. But before I could say anything, he raised a small glass jar, looking at it as if it held an ominous energy imprisoning his soul. Angelo stood still, clutching the jar, looking at me with hollow eyes. I had to do something. I couldn't let Angelo remain trapped forever. I took a deep breath, my voice trembling as I finally spoke to Angelo, telling him that his mother was no longer here. I told him to always believe that she loved him, so I urged him to move on. For a moment, Angelo's expression softened, but then he tightened his grip on the jar. His voice rang out again, firm and more desperate.
Where is my mom? I want to see her.
As if he didn't believe the words I was saying. Tears welled up in my eyes as I realized there were no words that could satisfy him. He wasn't just seeking peace. He wanted his mother, and nothing else mattered more than that. I could feel the air shift, the temperature drop, and for the first time in years, I felt fear. I couldn't let him stay. I had to help him find peace. Without thinking, I stepped toward him, my hands trembling. Angelo, I can help you find her. But first, you need to let go, to release everything. His gaze shifted from the jar to me, his hollow eyes filled with confusion and longing. Slowly, very slowly, he began to loosen his grip on the jar. As it fell from his hand and shattered on the floor, the room went silent. Angelo's figure began to fade, dissolving into the moonlight. Before he disappeared completely, I heard his voice one last time, soft, almost a whisper.
Thank you.
I stood outside the house. The weight that had burdened it for years was gone. Angelo was finally free. The feeling of guilt lingered, but I knew I had finally helped him find the peace he had been searching for all these years. The love his mother had for him, the love that had anchored Angelo to this world, had freed him. Perhaps he was beginning to understand the painful truths that even I never wanted to hear. He would likely continue his journey to find his mother in another world where he truly belonged. I looked back at the house one last time. It no longer felt haunted. Now, it was just a house, quiet and still. Angelo had gone, but he left behind something much more enduring. It was a son's love for his mother, transcending the boundaries of life and death. Ghosts at the theater. Jane was a beautiful woman. She often filmed famous or mysterious locations with her crew, doing whatever it took to gain fame. Today, Jane was standing in the bathroom of the Birdcage Theater, also known as the Birdcage Theater in Arizona, which was now out of operation. Surrounded by whispers about the past, she looked in the mirror and applied lipstick with excitement welling up inside her. Hundreds of thousands of followers are waiting for her latest video, and she plans to take them on a dramatic journey about the haunted history of this famous theater. It is famous for its cruel history of violence and death. As she leaned closer to the mirror, something blurred at the edge of her vision. An indistinct shape hovered behind her. Startled, She screamed and quickly turned back to look. That surprise was from her boyfriend, Ken. He responded with an amused and teasing attitude. She started complaining about him scaring her. But after the laughter and teasing, she still felt something truly behind her, making her think about the curses that haunted this place. Ken set up the phone, urging her to start recording, and Jane was ready to begin. Through her journeys exploring haunted houses and places, she had built an online persona as someone who delved into the paranormal. Sharing such stories made her following grow continuously. Her sixth sense leads her to supernatural encounters. She begins to tell the dark, mysterious stories behind this birdcage theater. She started passing places like bars and old tables that made her feel a dark energy around her. Jane shivered and continued, recounting stories of gunfights and dreams. Broken ended life here. Suddenly, the piano in the corner played a faint, haunting melody. It was only a few notes, but they seemed to echo endlessly. Jane kept her camera steady, moving toward the staircase. As she climbed the stairs, she suddenly felt like she heard the mournful cry of someone, seemingly a woman. She carefully looked around. There was no one else, or any changes. She started to turn to ask Ken, but it seemed like no one heard that except me. Finally, she reached the theater's dressing room. The room was dark, with faded, peeling wallpaper at the corners. Jane felt a sharp, terrible pain in her heart as she stepped inside. She started sitting against the wall, trying to breathe. Ken worriedly told her to stop, but she was stubborn and determined to have footage at this place. Jane begins to recall the tragic gossip story of Margarita, a dancer and aspiring actress. She is in her prime. She was murdered by her own colleague in this very room. She was stabbed through the heart with a high heel by someone envious of her success. It was said that her spirit haunted the room, seeking revenge or even a way to live again. Despite the lingering pain, Jane was intrigued. She was a bit scared, but couldn't ignore Margarita's ghost story. It would complete her video perfectly. She returned to the bathroom to prepare. When she stood in front of the mirror, something was different. Jane leaned closer, squinting into the darkness. That's when she actually saw something. A ghostly figure stood behind me, his face pale and painted, his eyes sunken and dark. She wore an old dress, her expression a distorted mixture of longing and anger. I feel like maybe it's Margarita. She quickly raised her phone to record a video. The pain returned, piercing her chest like a blade, but Jane persisted in capturing her reflection on the glass. After a while, Ken didn't see Jane anywhere. Worried, he went to check near the restroom. The door was wide open, and he saw Jane acting very strangely. He was shocked to see Jane standing in front of the mirror, talking to herself, and he asked if she was okay. She slowly turned to look at Ken from head to toe and said, "Who are you?" Her words sounded strange, foreign. Her eyes widened in confusion. He chuckled awkwardly, thinking I was pulling one of my usual dark jokes. Clearly, there was some truth being overlooked. Ken led that girl out of the theater, unaware that his real girlfriend was trapped in the mirror, freeing a vengeful spirit. Jane was bound to this place with no escape. She screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the darkness. Unheard, she felt the weight of centuries pressing down on her. She was trapped. Perhaps she had been possessed when Jane started filming Margarita. Margarita had stolen Jane's life and identity, and now she was out in the world, free to pursue the fame that had been taken from her long ago. In the days that followed, Jane's social media was filled with increasingly strange and terrifying posts. Her followers loved the change, but no one knew they weren't following Jane, they were following Margarita, who was dead and now replacing Jane. Reflection in the mirror. It was an August summer. the season where the days were long and the nights seemed endless. I was lying down watching TV, enjoying a relaxing day off. I have a friend named Leo. One day, Leo brought home something strange, a book titled How to See Spirits. He had stolen it from his grandmother. I felt uneasy, but at that age, curiosity often overpowers fear. That night, we decided to try one of the rituals in the book. The ritual was simple, just a candle and a mirror, and we had to perform it at 4 a.m. We met in front of an old apartment building. It seemed like the perfect place to summon something. We got into the elevator, holding the mirror and candle as instructed, and went up to the top floor. Once we reached the top, we lit the candle and held the mirror to the side, careful not to look directly into it. We stood in the dark, waiting, our eyes fixed on the faint reflection in the mirror. At exactly 4:44, Leo whispered, "There's nothing here," and for a moment, I thought he was right. But then, the candle went out. Darkness swallowed us. I fumbled for the elevator door, but when we got there, the lights inside flickered, and in the mirror, I thought I saw something. It was shaped like a demon with long hair. That figure stood right behind us, glaring with glowing red eyes, unblinking. Leo grabbed my arm, and we started running. We didn't stop until we were far away from the building, the first rays of dawn lighting up the road. Leo finally called his grandmother. When he told her what we had done, she was furious, warning us that what we saw wasn't just a regular ghost. It was something much more dangerous. If we weren't careful, we could lose our lives. There was a way to stop it. We had to perform another ritual, blindfold ourselves, and hold a mirror. We were not allowed to look at anything until the sun fully rose. That night, Leo and I stayed in the room, too scared to do anything but wait for dawn. The night dragged on, each minute feeling like an eternity. I couldn't sleep because of the fear, so I talked to Leo. As time passed, Leo grew quieter, mumbling, "Let's try taking off the blindfold." I told Leo to stop and remember the instructions. But then, Leo's voice came from somewhere, saying he hadn't said anything, asking what I was talking about to myself. Then the whispers continued by my ear, telling me the sun had already risen, to take off the blindfold. I was confused, unable to tell what was real. Could this be the demon's trap, set to make us break the rules? And then it happened. I heard the door creak, too afraid to look, but I could feel Leo moving. I told him to stop, not to open the door, but all I got in return was silence. I felt lost in my own darkness and fear. I didn't know what was happening. I closed my eyes, squeezed them shut as tight as I could, praying the sun would rise soon. I heard the door open, footsteps, then silence. It kept repeating, but I held on. Then, I didn't know when, but I must have fallen asleep. Through my blindfold, I could faintly see the glow of the sunlight. I quickly grabbed the mirror and smashed it on the floor, the sound of breaking glass shattering the morning silence. But something wasn't right. Leo was gone. I called out to him, but there was no answer, and I cautiously removed my blindfold to look around the room, but he wasn't there. Weeks later, my family had to move to a new place. I lost contact with Leo. From that day on, I couldn't find any trace of him. Some say he came back, still in that room, mumbling to himself, scratching at his eyes, and saying he's waiting for someone to return. Now, every night, I sleep with an eye mask and earplugs. I can't look into mirrors at night. I don't know, maybe we're paying the price for what we did. And sometimes, in the middle of the night, when the world is quiet, through my earplugs, I can hear the faint whisper that tells me it's still waiting for me. When I walk home when I'm least alert, I always catch a glimpse of it in the corner of my eye, but just a shadow, a reflection, fleeting indistinctly. And I know one thing for sure, never summon something you can't send back. because the consequences will be unpredictable. Abandoned McDonald's. For the past few weeks, I had been planning a vlog to explore and uncover the rumors surrounding an abandoned McDonald's that had been circulating for years. Stories of massacres and unsolved crimes. Today, I finally made it here. As I drove towards it, my hands trembled with excitement, though the thought of experiencing it was pretty terrifying. But I believed that if this video went live, it would break all records on my channel. I arrived. It was truly an abandoned store, with peeling paint and dust-caked, grimy windows, giving it a very eerie feel. I took a deep breath and prepared to step through the door to explore. Inside, everything was eerily silent. The floor was dotted with patches of mold. The tables and chairs were arranged neatly, but covered with a thick layer of dust. I scanned my camera over the dining area, trying to capture every detail. The old menu was still there, faded and barely legible, just like the posters on the wall, all rotting from years of abandonment. I made my way towards the kitchen. Familiar machines like the ice cream maker and deep fryers were still there, but none of them were intact, all rusted beyond repair. Behind the counter, there was a large black mold patch on the floor. It sent shivers down my spine, as if someone had lain there for so long that their body had decomposed into the floor. I had heard rumors that the police once found a body here. I moved forward, trying to ignore the growing unease within me. I headed towards the restroom, just as my flashlight began to flicker. Suddenly, I felt something, a figure behind me. Startled, I turned around, only to see a Ronald McDonald statue grinning back at me. It didn't look anything like I remembered from my childhood. I forced a nervous laugh. I told myself it was just a statue, nothing to worry about. I continued, leaving the strange figure behind, heading towards the restroom. As I reached the restroom door, a musty smell hit my nose, but I pushed the door open anyway. I wanted to confirm a rumor that a killer had hidden a body here. I didn't know if it was true. I walked inside. There wasn't anything too unusual, just an old restroom, fairly spacious, covered in spots of stubborn moss. I felt a small sense of relief. I began panning the camera around every corner of the restroom. Maybe this place wasn't haunted like everyone said. In the end, rumors were just rumors. I left the room, but I couldn't shake off a strange feeling like I wasn't the only one here. My eyes darted to the floor, and I noticed dark stains that I hadn't seen before. I moved closer to capture them clearly on camera. Suddenly, I tripped, dropping the camera. As I bent down to pick it up, instinctively, I looked up and saw a horrifying sight right before my eyes. Hanging from the ceiling, there was a body suspended in the air, the red uniform with the unmistakable golden arches. It was a McDonald's employee. Her face was gaunt, her eye sockets empty and black, with long hair and arms swaying loosely from the ceiling. I needed to get out. My hands shook as I scrambled to grab my camera as quickly as possible. I had to leave, and fast. Now I believed the rumors were true. This place was haunted, cursed. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I found a police station. I told them everything, handed over my camera, and waited for them to investigate. When the police searched the restaurant, they found nothing. But what about the footage on my camera? I reviewed all the footage of the restaurant, the kitchen, the restroom, everything was there. But when it got to the part with the Ronald McDonald statue, there was no statue at all. The terrifying scenes I had witnessed, none of it was in the video. I was left speechless, with no explanation. Man in black cloak. The sun shone down on a small village nestled among towering mountains. An old suspension bridge stretched across the rushing St. River, its wooden planks creaking in the wind. His name was Brandon, and he was sitting at the table, surrounded by stacks of books as he prepared for the bar exam. The stress weighed heavily on him. and he decided to take a break in a secluded spot. Stepping outside, the chilly late October air hit him. Brandon walked past a few nearby houses, the crunch of dry leaves underfoot creating a soothing sound. As he approached the suspension bridge, he gazed at the rushing river below. He closed his eyes, taking in the fresh air of nature. Suddenly, he felt the presence of someone nearby. He opened his eyes and saw a man in a black cloak standing in the middle of the bridge, fully shrouded. Brandon's heart raced as he saw the man drawing something on the railing of the bridge. A sense of unease rose within him, and he chose to avoid the man, turning back toward the forest along the riverbank. The overgrown trail ahead was thick with brush. He carefully tread over the uneven ground, trying to shake off the lingering anxiety after his encounter with the man. Emerging from the foliage, he reached the creek's edge. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the ground. A brief sense of peace washed over him, but it was fleeting. In the fading light, Brandon saw flickering flames ahead. Confusion filled him, as he had expected to be alone out here. Curiosity rose despite his unease. Brandon moved closer, the crackling sound of the fire growing louder. As he approached, he saw 3 people in black cloaks standing around a man who looked injured, bound and covered in blood, lying on the ground. He could only hold his breath in fear. The flickering torchlight cast strange shadows, making the scene even more horrifying. They chanted ominously, in a language Brandon couldn't understand. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the terrifying sight. Panic rose within him, and he knew he needed to leave. One of the cloaked figures pulled out a knife, and Brandon's instincts screamed that something was wrong. He couldn't stay here any longer. He had to run. Just as he was about to flee, the man Brandon had seen on the bridge appeared, stepping out of a small boat nearby, his hood falling back to reveal tattoos covering his pale skin. At that moment, the man pointed in Brandon's direction, and in an instant, it was clear he had seen him. The world around him seemed to fade into darkness, and the man's demonic eyes appeared to pierce through his soul. The discomfort Brandon had felt earlier on the bridge turned into pure terror as the man began to move toward him quickly and menacingly. Brandon's instincts kicked in immediately. He forgot about the poor man being held as a sacrifice and started running. He could hear the man's breath behind him as he ran through the brush, branches whipping against his face. The twigs scratched at his arms as he ran, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Brandon was losing strength, and the distance to safety seemed endless. He finally emerged from the forest and onto the trail. The man and his cloak were still behind him, so he turned left toward the bridge. As there were no houses nearby and no one to call for help, the weight of exhaustion hit him, but there was no time to rest. He turned around and saw the man approaching, his face like a mask of rage. When he reached the middle of the suspension bridge, he stood there in disbelief and filled with fear. He looked at the wooden railing and read the mark that the cloaked man had written less than half an hour ago. It was barely legible, as it had been etched with a blade, but he was certain it read, Brandon McCain, August 7th, 1993, to October 20th, 2021. It was his name, along with his birth date. He realized that perhaps today would be a milestone in his life. And when he noticed the man approaching, holding a dagger, that could be the day he was about to die. The man swung the blade at him, and Brandon only had a few minutes to act. Brandon forgot all the legends, the depth, and the freezing temperatures, the river that could be a monster pulling him under. He didn't care. He lifted his right leg onto the railing, and as the man moved, Brandon dodged the blade that nearly pierced him. As the icy water splashed around him, his blood circulation became erratic. He only had enough time to look up and see the man on the bridge, still watching. But the freezing water dragged him down, and his body began to tremble as unbearable pain engulfed him. Brandon was nearly lost to disorientation. sinking slowly before closing his eyes, perhaps never to open them again. Intruder on Halloween. The clock ticks softly, its sound nearly drowned out by the eerie music playing on the TV. Colorful costumes and decorations adorn the walls, remnants of the Halloween festival. Tonight, like every year, I was going trick or treating with my best friend, Casey. Excitement filled the air as we stuffed our bags with candy, the weight of our haul increasing after each house we visited. The streets were filled with laughter and the sound of children running from house to house. As we walked, we noticed a man standing near a lamppost. He wore a mask and held a flickering lantern. His eyes seemed to follow us as we passed by, sending a chill down my spine. I glanced at Casey, and we quickened our pace. We continued our journey, laughing and screaming as we collected treats, but occasionally, I caught a glimpse of the masked man lingering just out of reach. It felt like he was watching us. At one house, while we were busy stuffing our bags, I turned around and saw him standing on the street, intently watching us. I yelled at Casey to get away, that we needed to run fast from there. We hurried to the front door of the house we were at and knocked frantically. The homeowner opened the door. We explained that there was a scary man outside. The couple looked worried and ushered us inside for safety as the masked man moved further down the street. After a few minutes, we saw the masked man had left, and we thought we could leave the house now. Just as we thought we had escaped, I spotted him hiding behind a tree, waving at us. Panic flooded me. He only backed away when an adult threatened to call the police. After walking a few more blocks, we crossed a small wooden bridge over the river. The night air was fresh and cool, but a sense of unease washed over me as a black Jeep stopped on the other side. The driver leaned out the window. A spooky man wearing a pumpkin mask called out to us in a gravelly voice. "We need directions," he shouted. I felt a bit suspicious and distrustful of this man, so I declined and we kept moving. The Jeep couldn't cross the bridge, so we had to drive away. But just when we thought we were safe, a long time later, an SUV screeched around the corner of the bridge and stopped right in front of us. The window rolled down, revealing a man who was probably someone else, but he was also wearing the same mask. Then he said, "Get in the car, and they have free bags of candy," the man shouted, his voice filled with manipulation. My heart raced as I glanced at Casey. We turned back to running when I heard the car roar again. The man started to get out of the car. We just ran as fast as we could to the house because we were almost home. We finally arrived home. My mother left for work, so it was just the two of us at home. Tonight, Casey slept at my house to stay safe. Every second passed as I looked out the window uneasily at that man in the pumpkin mask. The memory of the Jeep, everything was still in my mind. Mine. The streets were pitch black, darkness stretching over the sidewalk. I held my phone, staring at the screen, hoping to distract myself from the rising anxiety within. Suddenly, my phone buzzed. A message from Casey. What if they come back? I glanced at her, but she was still peacefully asleep, unaware of the tension suffocating the room. I cautiously approached the window and peered through the curtains. My heart skipped a beat. The black Jeep was parked outside my house. I whispered urgently, shaking Casey awake. Casey's eyes flew open in fear. We both sat up, listening intently. The engine roared, and I could see a shadow moving inside the Jeep. My pulse quickened, and I knew we had to act and come up with a plan. I whispered, "If he comes in, we have to trap that man." We gathered supplies, a heavy chair, some rope from my dad's toolbox, and my phone, so I could call for help if needed. We figured we could block the door if he came in, trapping him inside. Casey nodded, and we hurriedly propped the chair against the door, tying it tightly with the rope. We were ready and positioned behind the chair, preparing for anything that might happen. Through the glass, I saw the masked man standing by the front door, his shadow ominously stretching. My heart raced as he knocked, the sound echoing like thunder in the silence of the night. Suddenly, I saw the man step back, turn around and walk towards the Jeep. I watched in horror as another figure stepped out of the car, both wearing masks and dark clothes. My mind is racing now. There are two people, I whispered. Fumbling for my phone, Casey, we need to call the police. Fear gripped me, knowing our trap might only buy us a little time to escape safely. But before I could dial, I heard footsteps approaching the house. The doorknob rattled, and my heart raced. The masked man yelled something indistinct, and I felt panic rise. They're trying to get in, I said, gripping Casey's arm tightly. I heard them banging on the door, trying to break it down. The chair held for now, but I knew it wouldn't last long. Call the police, I shouted, but Casey was frozen in fear, her eyes wide. I took a deep breath and tried to stay calm. I whispered, we need to run, and when they break in, Casey and I will head for the back door. With a loud crash, the chair toppled over. The door swung open. The masked man charged into the living room, followed by another figure. I slowly crawled toward the door, then grabbed Casey's hand, and we ran toward the back door, quietly escaping the intruders. We bolted out into the backyard and ran toward the fence. Behind us, I heard the men shouting. I shouted for Casey to climb over the fence. I thought we still had hope and needed to seize this chance to try to get over. As things grew urgent, I started to climb up, but unfortunately for me, one of them came outside and managed to grab and pull my leg. I flailed and kicked at his face, but it didn't seem to matter. It didn't faze him at all. I fell painfully to the ground. I looked in agony as Casey cried in fear by the fence on the other side. I screamed for her to run. I would follow, but she seemed too scared, worried for my safety. I lay in pain, watching him grin grotesquely. He taunted me, saying trick or treat, and waved at Casey playfully, enjoying our fear. I reassured myself that I needed to escape and survive. I slowly, secretly grabbed the ice and stood up to answer his question as if I was pretending to play with him. I took candy out of my pocket and said I wouldn't run away. I asked if he wanted a piece of candy. He seemed surprised and didn't notice as I threw the rock at his face. He fell, screaming in pain, and his friend came out from the house, witnessing it. He also yelled in anger. I didn't think much, trying to use the remaining strength to climb over the fence to escape. Just as we were about to escape, I heard the distant sound of a siren. I felt relieved. The police were coming. I headed toward the front yard to meet them. When we reached the front yard, the flashing lights of the police car lit up the street. The officers ran toward us, and I pointed at the men trying to flee back to the Jeep. "They're over there," I shouted, and the police sprang into action, chasing after them. Within minutes, the police had apprehended the masked men. Back inside the house, my mom rushed in, just returning home. She pulled us into a tight hug, relief evident on her face. Casey and I exchanged glances. We were finally safe. My mom made us a cup of hot cocoa, and as I took a sip, I couldn't help but reflect on how quickly everything had turned from a night of fear to a sense of safety. I said, glancing at Casey, maybe Halloween isn't so bad after all. Horror Story Nightwalkers. I used to work at a small hotel on the edge of town. The hotel was quite peaceful, nestled between dense woods and a long, deserted road. After a hurricane swept through the town, business slowed down significantly. I worked the night shift from 6 o'clock p.m. to 2 o'clock a.m., often without seeing anyone for hours. The only sound in the empty lobby was the ticking of the old clock on the wall. One night, I was sitting in the break room, sipping warm coffee and watching the security monitors when I heard a deep voice call out from the lobby. I got up and went to the front desk. There was a man standing on the other side of the glass partition. He was tall, with wild hair and a strange, jittery energy about him. He asked for some towels, so I handed them to him through the opening under the glass. He grabbed them with such force that it made me flinch, and then he left without saying another word. Curious, I watched him on the security monitor as he walked down the hallway, rubbing the towels against his face and neck. It was bizarre, but I shrugged it off and returned to the break room. About 10 minutes later, I heard his voice again. This time, he was back at the front desk, banging on the glass. "My key card isn't working," he shouted. I asked for his room number, but he responded strangely, saying something like 2C Pui, which didn't match our room numbering system. When I told him that, his demeanor changed. He leaned close to the glass, his eyes wide and wild. "I'm going to kill you," he said with a cold smile. I froze as he repeated it, louder each time, until he was nearly screaming. I grabbed the phone and dialed 911, shouting at him that the police were on their way. He stared at me with that twisted smile, mocking me as I spoke to the dispatcher. Finally, he left the hotel, disappearing into the night. I was shaken but relieved that he was gone. I decided to stay in the lobby for the rest of my shift. When my relief arrived at 2 o'clock a.m., I hurried outside, eager to get home. The cold night air bit at my skin as I walked through the empty parking lot. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me, like someone walking on tiptoes. I turned around, and there he was, hiding behind a car. His eyes followed me from the shadows, and he whispered, "I'm going to kill you." Panic surged through me. I looked around, trying to decide what to do. My only chance was to run to the nearest house with a light on. I sprinted to the door and pounded on it, screaming for help. Just as he grabbed me from behind, the door flew open, and the homeowner shouted, scaring him off. I collapsed in relief as the homeowner called the police. The police arrived, but he had already disappeared. I identified him on the security footage, but they never caught him. To this day, I still wonder if he's out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for another chance. The Stalker. I worked as a cashier at a home improvement store, and my coworker, Nicole, quickly became my best friend. She was very sweet, a bit shy, and unfortunately, she was often hit on by customers. Most of the time, it was just harmless flirting or a dinner invitation that she politely declined. But one day, something different happened. Nicole told me about a man who had asked her out. She had declined, as usual, saying that she had a boyfriend. The man seemed irritated but left without causing any trouble. Later that day, he came back. Nicole was helping a customer, so I was alone at the counter when he approached me. He looked quite handsome, but there was something about him that made me feel uncomfortable. He spoke in a deep voice and said he was there to see Nicole. I asked how he knew her, and he lied, saying she had agreed to go out with him and that he was there to pick her up. I knew that wasn't true, so I told him she had already left, hoping he would go away. Instead, his expression darkened, and he crossed his arms, asking why he couldn't see her. Thinking quickly, I blurted out. "She's my fiancée." It was a lie, but it was the only thing I could think of to make him back off. His eyes narrowed, and he looked me up and down with disdain.
Someone like her with someone like you?
He scoffed at me. I held my ground, repeating that she wasn't available. He stared at me for a long moment before turning and leaving. I told Nicole what happened when she came back, and she felt creeped out but also found the fiancé excuse quite amusing. We laughed about it, thinking it was over. But 2 weeks later, the man returned, this time after dark. Nicole and I were closing up when we heard a loud bang on the glass door. We both jumped, and there he was, pressing his face against the glass, his eyes wild. "We're closed," I told him, but he didn't move. Nicole shouted at him to go away, but he just stared at us, his breath fogging up the glass. He pointed at me, his eyes full of rage. He yelled,
"I'm not here for her. I'm here for you. If I take out her husband, she'll be mine."
My heart pounded as I realized he intended to kill me. I told Nicole to run to the manager's office and call the police.
911, what's the emergency, please?
As she ran off, the man started ramming the doors, trying to break them down. I was terrified, but I knew I had to keep him outside. I grabbed a 2x4 from behind the counter, ready to defend myself if he got in. The glass doors shook violently, and I was sure they were about to give way. But then Nicole came running back, swinging another piece of wood and yelling that the police were on their way. The man finally stopped, glaring at me one last time before turning and disappearing into the night. The police arrived, but by then, he was long gone. We showed them the security footage, and they promised to keep an eye out for him. A few days later, we heard he had been arrested in a nearby town for stalking another woman. Nicole and I were both shaken by the experience. We quit our jobs shortly after and found safer work. We still talk about that night sometimes, grateful that we had each other's backs. But the memory of his twisted expression and the sound of him trying to break in still haunts me. Trained to hell. Rye, he had once been a professional thief. No matter where he was, he could carry out his actions smoothly. That day, the location was the subway, and it was also where he would pay a heavy price for his sins. While fleeing from pursuit, Rye boarded a subway train that looked quite old, carrying the scent of damp concrete, rust, and something faintly metallic, almost like the smell of blood. The subway car was nearly empty, except for a few scattered passengers in various cars. Most of them seemed lost in their own worlds. One was dozing off, another absorbed in their phone. But then, at the far end of the car, there was an older man who looked quite terrifying. He wore a long, dark coat, his face obscured by shadows, but his eyes were cold and piercing, chillingly sharp. Rye tried to shake off the discomfort, shifting in his seat, looking elsewhere. But the feeling of always being watched made him very alert. The subway suddenly jolted, the lights flickering more violently before dimming to a weak, pale yellow. The train began to slow down, the sound of the brakes screeching like a high-pitched wail echoing through the thief's skull. He glanced around, noticing that the other passengers had disappeared, leaving only him and the mysterious man at the end of the car. He tried to stand up, move toward the exit, but his legs were stiff. The man in the dark coat began to stand up, moving toward him with slow, deliberate steps, his eyes never leaving the thief. The subway train came to a complete stop. The doors remained closed. The thief was trapped. The man approached the thief, raising one hand with fingers unusually long and thin, and waved it slowly in front of the thief's face. The thief's eyes glazed over, his mind succumbing to the invisible power of hypnosis. His body went limp, collapsing into the seat as he was pulled into a vision, deeper and deeper, until the subway car completely vanished. Rai found himself standing in a nightmarish version of a subway station. The walls were cracked and oozing a thick black substance, the lights flickering. The tracks were covered in a dense, glowing red fog that seemed to rise from the very depths of the earth, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. The thief staggered forward, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he looked around, trying to find a way out. But the exits were blocked, sealed shut by heavy iron gates covered in chains and padlocks that had mysteriously appeared. A moment later, he suddenly saw a reflection in the glass, a reflection of himself, but with his coat tattered and scorched, his face pale and gaunt, with hollow, sunken eyes. His lips twisted into a grotesque, terrifying smile. Scenes of his past crimes played out before him, distorted and twisted into horrific images of suffering and despair. In one scene, he watched himself pickpocketing a man on the subway, but this time, the man turned to him, his face melting away to reveal a skull with eyes burning with fire. The skeletal figure grabbed the thief's wrist, pulling him into the darkness where the sound of screams echoed. Next, another vision unfolded. Rai broke into an apartment, and suddenly, the floor beneath him collapsed. He fell into a pit filled with writhing hands, clawing at his flesh as they dragged him down, as if pulling him into hell. The images kept coming, each more horrifying than the last. Each vision was a punishment for the sins he had committed. He saw himself as one of the damned, trapped forever on this hellish train, riding the tracks of torment for all eternity. Inside the train, the thief was surrounded by the ghosts of his past victims. Their eyes burned with the fire of hatred. In his own eyes, the furnace roared with life, the flames growing hotter until they consumed everything. The thief was left in total darkness. The thief snapped back to reality, gasping for breath, his body drenched in sweat. He was back in the subway car. The man in the dark coat was gone, leaving only the sound of the train clattering on the tracks. Shaking, the thief staggered to his feet and exited the train. As he stepped onto the platform, he glanced back at the subway car. The train pulled away, the sound of its departure echoing through the empty station. The thief stood alone, the weight of his sins pressing down on him. Now he knew that there was no escaping the consequences, the punishment for his actions. Since that day, he has lived in darkness, plagued by agonizing headaches that feel like torture. He must live in fear, haunted by what he had seen and experienced. Perhaps this is just one of the punishments he has to endure. The Yin and Yang train. The Midnight Express was a train shrouded in mystery and fear. It was said to appear only once a year on a stormy night, traveling through the remote countryside. Legend had it that those who boarded the train never returned. As a journalist for a local newspaper, I had always been skeptical of such tales, but I couldn't resist the lure of a good story. This year, I decided to investigate. It was a dark and stormy night, fitting for the task at hand. I drove to the old, abandoned train station where the Midnight Express was rumored to appear. The station was in disrepair, with weeds growing through the cracks in the platform and broken windows staring like empty eyes. The air was thick with anticipation and the distant rumble of thunder. I set up my camera and waited, the rain pouring down relentlessly. Just as I was beginning to doubt the legend, a distant whistle pierced the night. My heart raced as I saw the faint glow of the train's headlight approaching. The Midnight Express emerged from the darkness, an old steam engine with an eerie, almost spectral appearance. The train slowed to a halt, its doors creaking open. Despite my fear, I boarded the train, determined to uncover the truth. The interior was surprisingly well preserved, with plush seats and dim, flickering lights. The air inside was cold, and an unsettling silence hung over everything. I took a seat and prepared my notebook and camera, ready to document whatever I encountered. As the train began to move, I noticed that I was not alone. A few other passengers were scattered throughout the train, all of them staring straight ahead, their faces devoid of emotion. I tried to strike up a conversation with the man sitting across from me, but he remained silent, his eyes empty and hollow. A shiver ran down my spine. The train moved through the night, the storm raging outside. I decided to explore the other cars, hoping to find someone willing to talk. As I walked through the train, I noticed the passengers all had the same vacant expressions. They seemed more like mannequins than living people. My unease grew with each step. In the last car, I found a conductor. He was an old man with a weathered face and piercing eyes that seemed to see right through me.
Can I help you?
He asked, his voice gravelly and cold. I told him I was a journalist investigating the Midnight Express and asked about the passengers.
They are souls trapped between this world and the next. This train is their purgatory, a place where they must confront their past sins before moving on.
I felt a chill as I realized the gravity of his words. Why am I here? I asked. The conductor's eyes darkened.
You sought the truth, and now you are part of it. You must face your own demons before you can leave.
Panic set in as I tried to leave the car, but the door wouldn't budge. The train began to feel like a prison, the walls closing in on me. I ran back to my seat, hoping to find some way out. The passengers' faces seemed to contort into grotesque masks, their eyes following my every move. Desperate, I looked out the window, but the landscape had changed. Instead of the familiar countryside, I saw scenes from my own life, moments of regret, guilt, and pain. The train was forcing me to confront my own past. As the storm outside intensified, so did my memories. I realized I had spent my life running from my mistakes, never facing the consequences of my actions. The train slowed to a stop, and the conductor appeared again.
It's time,
he said. With a deep breath, I stepped off the train and into the unknown, ready to confront my past and seek redemption. The Midnight Express disappeared into the night, leaving me alone on the platform, but no longer afraid. I had found my story, and it was one that I would carry with me forever. The Mysterious Camp. I am a camping enthusiast. On this 2-day trip to the forest near my home, I went camping with my longtime companion Ring, the dog that has been with me for a long time. But I realized I was not as alone as I thought. It was in November. The daytime weather was quite warm, but it was quite cold at night. As always, I brought all the camping gear I had. Since it was close to the lake, I also brought a fishing rod to fish. I arrived and set up camp in a comfortable clearing near the lake to fish. While fishing, Ring kept looking into the forest, and his tail was wagging as if he had discovered something. I thought it was probably some small animals that he saw or heard. Ring is very well trained and will not run off without my command. After about an hour of fishing, we walked around the lake. On the other side of the lake, I saw a few people walking into the forest. They were too far away to be sure, but they really looked like humans. We quickly returned to the camp. When I got back to the camp, I saw the tent zipper was open. Someone had entered my tent, but nothing was missing. Not that there was much to take besides the campfire and fishing gear, but I knew I was right. They were a group of people. The thought of them sneaking into my tent without permission made me quite creepy. To be safe, I spent the next hour moving my camp to a different location further down the lake. Then I started chopping wood to light a fire. When the fire was burning, I fed Ring and then warmed up the food for dinner. Ring continued barking into the forest. By then, it was dark, and I couldn't see anything except the firelight. I looked into the darkness with a sense of fear. With that thought, I brought Ring into the tent and extinguished the fire. I crawled into my sleeping bag, and with the reading light beside me, I was reading my novel. Ring's ears kept twitching as he heard things that I couldn't hear. He kept looking around and started growling. I imagined someone out there in the darkness, scarier than a bear. Eventually, Ring calmed down and put his head down. I felt uneasy and wanted the night to pass quickly, so I turned off the light and went to sleep. I woke up a few hours later to the sound of growling and howling. I told Ring to be quiet. I listened and heard someone whistling, the kind of whistle you do to get a dog's attention. Someone was really out there at my camp in the thick darkness, and I was terrified. Then there were footsteps coming closer to the tent until they were right outside and then stopped. Ring howled madly, and I held him tight to keep him quiet without saying anything. There was no crackling fire, just absolute silence except for the wind. Looking towards the tent's zipper, I tried to deepen my voice and commanded and shouted, "You'd better get out of here, don't come any closer," then threatened them with my emergency flare gun. The footsteps moved away from the tent, slow and heavy. I couldn't sleep after that, but I was too scared to leave the tent and pack up in the dark. Then from a distance, the scream of a woman echoed for miles. It sounded like a woman really screaming for her life. That was the last straw. I grabbed my life quickly, put on my shoes, grabbed a flashlight, and ran. I sprinted until I reached my truck. I slept in the truck that night, and at dawn, I went back to the forest with Ring to pack up the camp. I didn't even check to see if my stuff had been rummaged through. I just hurried to get out of there. As soon as I had signal, I called the non-emergency police number I found online to report the scream and the suspicious people around my camp the night before. I don't know what happened after that and don't know what is going on in that forest, but I never went camping there again. Luckily for me, it was a memorable camping trip. Killer in the rain. It's late spring in a rural area with vast stretches of wilderness. My small house stands alone in the vast darkness, surrounded by trees, the type of isolation I always dreamed of before moving here. Here, I can live away from the noise, people, and stress of the city. But tonight, the silence feels different. Heavy rain has been pouring for days. I should have found this isolation peaceful, but tonight, it feels suffocating. I'm sitting on an old couch watching TV and listening to the rain pounding on the roof, a soothing sound that usually makes evenings pass peacefully. I enjoy staying home on rainy weekends like this, far away from the world. Around 6 or 7 in the evening, I suddenly heard a knock at the door. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it wasn't. Another knock, this time louder. I hesitated. Visitors were rare here. It was strange for someone to show up without calling first. Grabbing a flashlight, I walked toward the door, my heart already starting to race. When I opened the door, heavy rain poured down, and the damp cold hit my face. Standing in the pouring rain was a man, soaked and shivering. He wasn't anyone I knew, just a stranger. He told me he was camping in the nearby woods and had run into trouble. He needed a place to stay, just for the night. His voice was pleading, but something about him made me uneasy. I handed him my phone to call for help so he could get a ride to town, as I didn't feel safe. But he refused, insisting he only needed shelter for the night. I felt uncomfortable, the rain pouring down on both of us. His insistence made me even more suspicious. I bluntly told him he couldn't stay here. After pausing for a moment, he turned and walked down the dirt path leading back to the woods. I watched him disappear into the trees, his figure fading into the rain. I locked the door immediately, still feeling uneasy. I tried to shake off the strange encounter, telling myself I did the right thing. There was no way to know if he was dangerous, especially in such a remote place. The rain kept falling, and I sat back down on the couch, trying to focus on the TV, but my mind kept drifting back to that knock at the door. After 2 hours, I noticed something, a faint orange light shining through the curtains at the back of the house. I haven't checked the window in a while, but now there's something outside. I stood up and pulled the curtain aside. Through the rain and mist, I saw it far off in the woods behind my house, a small flickering campfire beneath a tree. Despite the heavy rain, the fire was still burning. There was a figure in the rain, but I couldn't make it out. That uneasy feeling turned into fear. Could it be him again? Why had he returned? And what was he doing out there, just standing near my house in the pouring rain? I picked up the phone and called the police. I didn't care if it took them an hour to get here. I needed someone to ensure he was gone. After the call, I glanced out the window again. The fire was still burning, but the figure had vanished. Panic surged through me. I rushed to the front window and saw him, the man from earlier, walking by with a rifle slung over his shoulder. He was heading toward the house, toward me. I staggered toward the closet in the hallway, my hands shaking as I grabbed the handgun and rubber bullets. I had bought it for protection, but I never really thought I would need it. I didn't want to hurt anyone. I pressed myself against the wall, listening to the man pounding on the front door. This time it was harder, as if he was hitting it with the butt of his rifle. I had to do something. I couldn't let him in. I yelled that I had a gun and it called the police. I stood still, gun in hand, straining to hear any sign of movement. Moments stretched on, and finally, after what felt like an eternity, I looked through the peephole. The porch was empty. I cautiously stepped outside, gun still in hand, immediately drenched by the rain. I saw large footprints, caked in mud. He was probably gone, at least for now. About an hour later, the police arrived and searched the area with flashlights. When they got to the campfire, they found something I hadn't expected. A rough canvas bag, half buried in the mud, covered in wet earth. They dug it up and opened it. Inside they found knives, zip ties, gloves, and rope. They told me it was likely a burglary kit, or worse. I never saw him again after that night. The police haven't found him yet. But they told me to be careful, to stay vigilant. Whoever he was, he had plans to come back, maybe even to kill me. Killer in the rain. It's been half a year since that night. The memory of that encounter still haunts me. I thought time would ease the anxiety, that the man would fade from my mind just like he disappeared in the rain. But as the months passed, the fear grew more intense. What if he came back? Tonight, as the sun set, the rain returned, pouring heavily, just like that day. I was sitting in my usual spot on the sofa, watching TV despite my efforts. My attention wasn't on the screen. I kept glancing at the window all evening, unable to shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching me. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. The sound cut through the rain, and my heart skipped a beat. Could it be happening again? I cautiously opened the door, but this time I was prepared. My hand resting on the pistol I had placed in the nearby drawer, ready for a moment like this. The porch was empty, except for the relentless sound of rain hitting the ground. But just as I was about to close the door, I noticed something. Footprints. Someone had been here, fresh and muddy, still sticking to the porch. I went back inside and locked the door. I grabbed my phone and called the police, explaining that I thought it was the same man who had tried to harm me years ago, and he was back. They said they'd send someone, but I had no idea how long it would take. For now, I was on my own. The rain continued, growing heavier by the minute, the wind picking up as well. I paced the living room, glancing out the window every so often. That's when I saw a flash of light deep in the woods. I realized I couldn't wait for the police to arrive. I had to confront him before he made his move. Panic welled up inside me, but this time, I reminded myself not to lose my composure. I grabbed a flashlight and my pistol, threw on a jacket, and headed out the back door. The rain drenched me the moment I stepped outside. I followed the flickering light deep into the woods. My flashlight cut slowly through the night as the muddy ground made every step feel heavy, not just from the mud, but from my hesitation to venture further. I continued on. As I ventured deeper, my steps became slower and more cautious. Then I crouched behind a tree to get a better look. It was him, unmistakable with the scar on his face. He was there, standing by the fire, his back to me. And in his hand was something different this time, not a rifle, but an axe. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The rain sizzled on the fire. I didn't know what he was doing, pacing back and forth, muttering to himself as if planning something. Suddenly, he stopped and turned toward my house. My house. He started walking, a strange smile spreading across his face. At first, he walked slowly, but then his pace quickened, the axe swinging in his hand as if he were preparing for a bloody hunt. He approached the house. I didn't have time to think he only had an axe after all. I pulled out my pistol and stepped out from behind the tree, shouting for him to stop, but he didn't stop. He kept walking, eyes fixed on my house, as if I weren't even there. I fired a warning shot into the air. The sharp sound cut through the rain and thunder. He stopped. For a moment, everything was still, as if the world itself held its breath. Then he turned to face me, cold, empty eyes and that twisted, horrifying smile. He raised the axe above his head. Before I could react, he charged. I fired twice. One shot missed, but the other hit his leg. He staggered, like a zombie, but still got up, the axe still raised. I shot again, this time hitting him in the shoulder. He dropped the axe, collapsing to the ground with a pained scream, unable to bear it anymore. Rain poured down on both of us, the fire flickering wildly in the wind. I stood over him, the gun still aimed, my hands trembling, uncontrollably. Finally, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. The police were coming. They surrounded the man, disarmed him, and pulled him to his feet. He glared at me as they dragged him away, his eyes filled with hatred. I returned to my house, locking the door behind me, and collapsed onto the sofa. The rain continued outside, but it no longer felt suffocating. For the first time in a long while, I finally felt truly safe. Scary night at the toy store. The night sky was heavy, and the large parking lot outside a quiet toy store was dimly lit by a few sparse streetlights. The store was about to close, and Sana, a woman in her 30s, walked toward the entrance. She held a list tightly in her hand. Her daughter's 6th birthday was coming up soon. Inside, the store was nearly empty. Sana walked past shelves filled with toys. She felt excited as she picked up stuffed animals and birthday decorations. As she walked, she had the unsettling feeling that someone was watching her. She glanced over and saw a man at the end of the aisle. He wore a long black coat and had a hat pulled low over his face. He just stood there, staring at her. Sana immediately looked away, pretending not to notice, but she could feel his eyes burning into her. She grabbed the last item on her list and moved to a different aisle, hoping to shake the strange and uneasy feeling. For the next 15 minutes, she tried to continue shopping, moving through different parts of the store. She hurried through checkout, her nerves on edge. After paying, she headed for the exit. The parking lot was almost empty, except for her car and a suspicious gray SUV parked nearby. The vast emptiness made the SUV's proximity unsettling. As she neared her car, Sana's heart raced when she heard a car door open from the other side of the SUV. The man in the black coat emerged from around the SUV. It was the same man from the store. Her fear began to rise as she recognized him. She thought she needed to hide for a while. Sana hurried inside, her breath quickening. The store was nearly empty now, and the isolation was overwhelming. She moved through the aisles, trying to lose the man in the maze of shelves. Every few minutes, she glanced over her shoulder. The man was there, trailing her through the store. He kept his distance but never let her out of his sight. Her hands trembled as she pulled out her phone. She quickly dialed her husband, and when he answered, she whispered urgently into the phone. He promised he would be there in less than 10 minutes. The minutes felt like hours as she moved around the store, pretending to browse but always keeping an eye on the man. At one point, he seemed to lose interest and walked toward the exit, but as Sana neared the checkout counter, he lined up right behind her. The air felt stifling. She quickly moved through rows of stuffed animals and dolls, praying that the man wouldn't see her anymore. She crouched behind a shelf, pressing her back against it. She looked around, but didn't see him anywhere. For a moment, she dared to hope that he had really left. But then, the soft sound of footsteps on the floor shattered her illusion of safety. He rounded the corner, his figure looming larger as he got closer. Sana's back pressed against the shelf, and a row of dolls wobbled. She flinched in fear as one of them fell to the ground with a soft thud. The man stopped just a few feet away. She glanced, her eyes alert, watching his every move. This close, she could make out more details. His gloved hands, the lower part of his face visible beneath the brim of his hat. A faint, crooked smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. He took another step toward her. He reached into his coat, and for a moment, Sana's heart stopped. Was he pulling out a weapon? What was he about to do? Suddenly, headlights swept across the parking lot as a car pulled in. Sana's husband had arrived, and his car stopped right in front of the toy store. The man glanced toward the lights, his expression stiffening, growing cautious. He stepped back into the shadows as Sana's husband drew closer. Sana saw her husband get out of the car. He walked toward the store, his eyes scanning the parking lot for her. She seized the moment and ran past the man, her heart pounding as she sprinted toward the store entrance. She didn't look back, but she could feel his eyes burning into her as she escaped. Sana rushed through the front door of the store, running toward her husband. Her face was pale, and her hands were trembling, but she was safe. She collapsed into his arms, her breath coming in gasps as the fear that had overwhelmed her began to fade. Her husband looked past her, scanning the store for the man, but the parking lot had returned to its eerie calm. The man in the black coat had disappeared, melting into the shadows. Her husband gripped the steering wheel, ready to drive them home, but Sana couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Later that night, Sana's phone rang. It was a call from the local police station. The man had been caught, They wanted her to come in and give a statement. The man had been arrested just hours after leaving the parking lot. A patrol car had spotted his SUV parked suspiciously in another lot near a shopping mall. When the police approached him casually, he resisted arrest, acting erratically. Sana listened intently as the detective began revealing disturbing details that had come to light after his arrest. During questioning, the man, identified as Dennis, initially refused to cooperate. He claimed he was just shopping late and looking for lost car keys, but his story quickly unraveled. The police found disturbing evidence inside his SUV, items that made Sana's skin crawl. First, there was a knife, wrapped in cloth and hidden under the passenger seat. It wasn't an ordinary knife. The blade was worn, and the handle was smooth from years of use. Next to it was a set of duct tape, rope, and zip ties, all stashed in a small canvas bag. Dennis had likely planned something far worse than just following her. The real horror came when they found the photos. Many were of women, all taken from a distance, some in grocery stores, others as they left malls, a few while walking their dogs. And then Sana's breath caught in her throat. Scattered among the pictures were photos of her, some from the toy store that night, and many others taken before. They were taken when she dropped her daughter off at school, when she went grocery shopping, and even when she left her apartment. Realizing Dennis had been following her for days, maybe weeks, made her feel sick. As the investigation continued, more terrifying truths about Dennis emerged. He often stalked women, but none of his victims had ever filed charges. He was disturbingly careful, always skirting the edges of the law, always evading arrest or detection. 2 years earlier, in another town, Dennis had been investigated for the disappearance of a woman, though no evidence was ever found. The case had since gone cold. Sana was horrified to realize she could have easily become another cold case, another missing person, if her husband hadn't arrived in time that night. The police assured her Dennis would be locked up and no longer a threat. Sana and her husband left the police station. They drove home in the quiet darkness. She glanced over at her husband, grateful that he had arrived just in time. But deep down, a new sense of caution had been born. She would never let her guard down like that again. Run away from strangers. The grocery store sat in the middle of a vast, empty parking lot, bathed in the faint glow of streetlights. It was 2 a.m. The store was closed, and the eerie quiet surrounded it. The night was still, until a soft tapping on the glass echoed in the darkness. I was the night shift manager here. Usually, things were calm, and nothing happened. It was just me, stocking shelves during the quiet hours while the outside world slept. I had been working non-stop since my shift began at 10 p.m., trying to get everything done. My focus was broken when I heard the faint tapping. It was coming from the front of the store. I left my cart and headed toward the sound. Through the large glass windows, I saw him, a man. He was leaning against the glass, trying to peer inside. His clothes were tattered, his face expressionless, with a hollow, vacant look in his eyes. He saw me the moment I came into view. I approached the glass door. I asked him what he wanted. He demanded I open the door. His face was emotionless, no hint of a smile, just cold eyes staring at me. I told him the store was closed and that he couldn't be here. As I turned to walk away, a loud bang startled me. The man's fists were pounding on the glass, over and over, each strike louder and angrier than the last. My heart raced. This guy wasn't just a harmless drifter. I pulled out my phone, showing him I was ready to call the police. Only then did he back off, his eyes still locked on me, filled with rage. Slowly, he stepped back into the shadows of the parking lot. The tension in me eased slightly. He was gone. I put my phone away and tried to focus back on my work. 15 minutes passed. The tapping, The pounding, the man, all of it faded from my mind as I immersed myself in stocking the shelves. But then I heard it, the sound of metal breaking, like something being torn apart. I abandoned the stroller and ran forward, fear rising. My heart sank when I saw the glass door slightly open. The lock, the only thing that kept the door secure, was missing. Fear gripped me as I realized what this meant. I need to go to the office, call the police now. I turned to run for the office, but I froze in place. Standing not far from me, blocking my path, was the man. His expression hadn't changed, still cold, still lifeless, filled with rage. I don't think anything. I just run. I burst through the door, the man right behind me. Suddenly, a beat-up van screeched into view, speeding toward the front of the store. It swerved dangerously, nearly hitting me as it stopped, my heart pounding in my chest. I moved forward, running past the van, but then everything flipped upside down. A sharp pain suddenly exploded at the back of my head. My body lurched forward as I fell to the ground. I didn't even have time to process what had happened before the world started fading. I felt hands grabbing me, roughly lifting me off the cold pavement. My vision blurred, darkness closing in, and the last thing I remembered was the roar of the van's engine and the sensation of being dragged inside. I woke up with a throbbing headache, my wrists tightly bound behind me. The van bounced and swayed as it sped down an unfamiliar road. My mind was foggy, disoriented. For a moment, I didn't know where I was. Then it all came rushing back. I started to string it together. Man, the truck. Perhaps I was kidnapped by him. My heart raced as I realized I needed to act, and fast. I glanced around. Inside, it was pitch black, but I could make out a pile of old tools, a rusted toolbox, and some scattered metal pieces on the floor. I twisted my wrists, testing the ropes. They were tight, but I could feel a slight give, just enough to give me hope. I could hear the driver muttering to himself up front. His voice was low, angry. This wasn't over. I took a deep breath, calming the panic rising inside me. I needed to think, and I needed to get out. I inched closer to the toolbox, my fingers searching for anything sharp. It was hard, but I found a small, jagged piece of rusted metal. I awkwardly twisted my hands, rubbing the metal against the ropes. My heart pounded with every noise the van made, every bump in the road that might expose me, each one painful enough to make me want to scream. Suddenly, I felt the ropes loosen. A few more scratches and they snapped. My wrists were free, but I couldn't move too quickly. I glanced toward the front seat, where I could see the back of the driver's head. He hadn't realized I was awake yet. I noticed the door latch wasn't locked. I needed a plan. The van slowed as it made a sharp turn onto a dirt road. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. Taking a deep breath, I yanked the back door open and jumped into the night. I hit the ground hard, pain shooting through my body as I tumbled over dirt and gravel. For a second, I thought I wouldn't be able to move, but adrenaline surged through me. I staggered to my feet, running into the thick darkness of the trees. Behind me, the van screeched to a stop. I heard the man shouting, his footsteps pounding as he chased after me, but I didn't look back. I just kept running, my heart hammering in my chest. The trees, the branches, scratched at my skin as I tore through the dense underbrush. My mind was foggy, teetering between fear and survival. I could hear the man crashing through the forest behind me, his breath heavy and furious. I couldn't let him catch me again. Ahead, I spotted a clearing and the faint glow of lights through the trees. A road. If I could get there fast, I'd be safe. I burst out of the woods and onto the road, waving my arms frantically as a car approached. The headlights blinded me, but I didn't care. I needed help. I ran into the middle of the road, screaming for them to stop. The car screeched to a halt, and I collapsed against the hood, gasping for breath. The driver jumped out, shouting something, but I was too exhausted to answer. All I could do was whisper, "Help me." The driver pulled out his phone, calling the police. I glanced back at the man. He stood at the edge of the woods, staring at me with cold, furious eyes. But he didn't come any closer. He knew it was over. The flashing lights of police cars lit up the dark road. Officers surrounded the van. The man already in handcuffs not far away. His face was cold, blank, disturbingly empty. I sat on the curb, still trembling, wrapped in a blanket the police had given me. The world felt strange, like a nightmare I couldn't wake from. But I was grateful, lucky to be alive. I was free. The police assured me that he'd be locked away, that he wouldn't hurt anyone else. But the thought still lingered in my mind. What if I hadn't escaped? What if I hadn't been fast enough? As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, I stood by the car, watching the police take the man away. The fear was still there, clinging to the edges of my mind, but I knew I had survived. I had been lucky to survive the night shift. Weird night at school. I work the night shift as a janitor at a local school. This job is ideal for anyone who enjoys solitude. It's just me, the empty school, and my mop bucket. I only talk to my coworker when it's absolutely necessary. Most of the time, we split the school and don't see each other during the entire shift. One night, the whole school was completely silent. The only sound was the occasional echo of my mop hitting the floor. I've done this thousands of times, but something about this night felt different, like something was watching me from the darkness. I brushed it off and continued cleaning, walking through each hallway. I wore my headphones, playing music softly enough to still hear if someone was around, but everything seemed normal. I took a short break to change the water in my mop bucket. When I came back, I noticed something strange. The wet floor sign I had set up earlier was knocked over. I sighed and went to pick it up, but that's when I saw them small, wet footprints leading away from the sign and down the hallway. I followed the footprints down the hallway, leading to the stairs up to the second floor. The footprints stopped at the top of the stairs. I paused, trying to hear anything. Then, I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. It was fast, a flash of movement at the end of the hall. My pulse quickened, and I hurried to the end of the hall, but no one was there. Just then, I heard faint laughter, like the giggle of a child. It echoed through the empty school, sending chills down my spine. I turned around, looking for the source of the laughter, but saw no one. A loud crash suddenly broke the silence. The sound came from the first floor. My mop bucket, which I had just filled with clean water, was tipped over, spilling water all over the floor. My blood boiled with frustration. Someone was messing with me, and I wasn't in the mood for games. I grabbed a dry mop and started cleaning up. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. My mind raced, trying to figure out what was going on. Were there still students in the building, or had someone snuck in after hours? I decided to talk to my coworker. Maybe she had seen something too. She laughed and told me I was messing with her. She looked at me, completely confused, shaking her head. I've been here the whole time. I couldn't make sense of it. I left her station, more confused than ever, and went back to work. Another hour passed. I was trying to make up for lost time when, without warning, the entire school went dark. For a moment, I was surrounded by darkness. Then the emergency lights flickered on, bathing everything in a dim red glow. It was unsettling, like the entire building had turned into the set of a horror movie. I knew where the electrical room was, and since I had the keys, I decided to head there to fix the lights. But before I could get there, I heard a scream. My coworker's scream, filled with fear, echoed through the school. I ran toward the electrical room, fear rising inside me. When I reached the door, I noticed it was slightly ajar. My heart pounded in my chest. When I pushed the door open, expecting to see my coworker inside, instead, there was a figure standing in the darkness. I couldn't make out who it was, but something was wrong. My blood ran cold as the figure moved closer, its movements unnatural, almost jerky. I reached for my phone, but before I could pull it out of my pocket, the figure lunged forward and slammed the door in my face. Panic overwhelmed me. I staggered back. I had to get out of there. I ran, my legs moving faster than ever. I needed to find my coworker. When I reached her area, her mop bucket was lying in the middle of the hallway, but she was gone, no sign of her. I called out her name, but there was no reply. The only sound was that faint laughter again, echoing through the empty hallway. The whispering froze me in place, my heart pounding in my chest. I quickly turned around, gripping the mop handle tightly, ready to defend myself. I started walking again, my steps slow and cautious, my senses on high alert. This wasn't just a prank. Something was happening here, something I couldn't explain. I went up to the second floor, where I had heard the laughter earlier. As I ventured further down the second floor hallway, I noticed something strange. The wet footprints, the same ones I had seen earlier, were back. I froze, staring at the small, wet prints that seemed to be coming toward me. I ducked into the nearest classroom, slamming the door behind me. I leaned against it, trying to catch my breath, my hands trembling. The silence was suffocating, pressing in on me from all sides. That's when I saw the blackboard. Written in large, jagged letters were the words, "Hello." I hadn't seen that before. Someone had been in here, but I hadn't heard anyone enter. Suddenly, I heard the door rattling. Something was trying to get in. The doorknob twisted hard, and the door shook as if someone or something was pounding on it. I backed away, gripping the mop handle like a lifeline. The banging stopped. Silence returned, but the tension in the air remained. I slowly crept toward the door, pressing my ear against it. Nothing. I reached for the doorknob, turning it as gently as I could. I cracked the door open just a little and peeked out into the hallway. I cautiously stepped out, looking around for any sign of movement. I had to find my coworker. I couldn't stay in this school alone any longer. I started walking down, and just then, from where I stood, I saw a shadow at the bottom of the stairs. It didn't move, just stood there, a dark figure faintly illuminated by the red emergency lights. I squinted, trying to make out the shape. It was small, like a child. As I got closer, I could see more clearly a young boy, maybe 13 or 14, standing with his back to me, wearing a torn school uniform. I reached out, hesitating for a moment before speaking. "Hey, are you okay?" The boy didn't respond. I took another step, my hand trembling as I reached out to touch his shoulder. The boy's face was a grotesque mask, pale, soulless eyes, blood dripping from his nose, and a wide, twisted grin. My heart nearly stopped. The child let out a piercing scream that echoed through the staircase, a sound so shrill it felt like it was tearing through my skull. I stumbled back, dropping the mop. My legs felt weak, but I forced myself to run. I sprinted down the hallway, gasping for breath. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get out. The hallway seemed to stretch on endlessly in a horrific way. I burst through the double doors into the gymnasium, slamming them shut behind me. The gym was pitch black. I backed away from the door, my body shaking with fear. The footsteps stopped. The doors stayed closed. For a brief moment, I thought I was safe. But then, From the far corner of the gym, I heard a ball bouncing. There, in the far corner, the boy stood, his face still twisted in that grotesque grin, holding a basketball and slowly bouncing it on the floor. Then the boy whispered, "Hello," his voice echoing in the empty space of the gymnasium. I backed away, my legs trembling. The child took a step forward, then another. Each step was slow, deliberate, as if he was savoring the fear he was causing. I didn't think anymore. I bolted, running as fast as I could toward the parking lot. My legs felt like they could give out at any moment, but I kept running. I didn't stop until I reached my car. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, finally unlocking the door and jumping inside. As I started the engine, I looked back at the school. In one of the second-floor windows, I saw the child standing there, staring down at me with that twisted grin. I floored the gas and sped out of the parking lot. The image of that child burned into my mind. I didn't go back the next night. I never went back there again. The outcome of the Hitchhiker Man. I was working the third shift at a 24/7 diner in a quiet town. Most of our customers were truck drivers and travelers passing through. But the strangest people I've ever met were the drifters, addicts, and hitchhikers. That night started like any other. Carl, the cook, had been working at this place for over 15 years, and he had seen it all. His sharp eyes could spot trouble from a mile away. We were perfectly in sync. I served tables, and he flipped burgers. With a new cast in the pipeline, and he flipped burgers. Around 4 a.m., the shift was well underway. The place was completely silent, not a single person in sight. The only sound breaking the silence was the hum of the old refrigerator. Suddenly, the door creaked open. A man stumbled in, clutching his right arm to his chest. He didn't say a word, just shuffled past Carl and me, heading straight to the bathroom. His clothes were torn and filthy, and his face was twisted in pain. Carl and I exchanged glances. We'd seen strange customers before, but there was something off about this guy, more than just a regular drifter. I asked Carl, "Doesn't he look familiar?" After a moment, I remembered. That guy had come in before, begging for food and a ride. We had to kick him out because he was bothering the customers. But now, something had changed. He looked panicked, like he had seen something terrifying. Carl just shook his head, muttering, "Here we go again." I looked at the bathroom door. I didn't want to check on him, but I didn't have much choice. Carl handed me the keys, nodding toward the bathroom. "Go check if he's all right." I knocked on the door, asking if he needed help, but there was no response. I knocked again, harder this time. Still, nothing. I called out, fumbling with the keys. I pushed the door open, saying I was coming in. The bathroom was empty. No trace of the man. No dirt, no blood, nothing. The bathroom was as clean as the night before. I froze at the doorway. "End and year and ye and Androd." I screamed for Carl. He rushed over. I backed away as he pushed past me, staring into the spotless room with wide, disbelieving eyes. We stood behind the counter, both of us trying to make sense of what had just happened. How could he have disappeared? I looked at Carl, but he had the same horrified expression as I did. Then I saw movement near the front window. The man was outside, staring at us. His face was worse than before, bloody, swollen, and his eyes were bleeding. But what froze me in place was how his right hand hung limply at his side, looking like it was about to snap off. His thumb was sticking straight up, unnaturally stiff, as if he was trying to hitch a ride. Before I could grab the phone to call 911, a loud noise echoed from the back of the diner. Carl and I rushed to the back. It was coming from the freezer. Someone was tearing into the food boxes. Carl grabbed a knife from the counter, and we slowly moved in. The man was inside, tearing open a box of frozen meatballs and pressing a pile of meat against his arm, like he was possessed. But his arm, it wasn't right. His hand was dangling, almost detached from his wrist. For a moment, everything went still. We locked eyes on him, witnessing something we couldn't believe. Then, at an unnatural speed, he bolted past us, kicked the kitchen door open, and ran outside. Carl and I stood there, too shocked to react. We had just witnessed the impossible. Carl hurried to the front, locked the diner doors, and turned off the lights, plunging the place into darkness. The only light now came from the neon sign outside, casting a dim red glow on the counter. I stood in the middle of the kitchen, my hands trembling. My mind raced, trying to piece together what had just happened. That man, if he was really injured, was moving with an unnatural speed and strength. And those eyes, it was like something else was controlling him. When I looked out the window, the parking lot was empty. There was no sign of the man. Carl stood with me, his face tense, his eyes scanning the darkness outside. I asked Carl what we should do now, and if we should call the police. Carl shook his head and said they wouldn't believe us, and there was no way to explain this. He reconsidered, slowly walking to the phone and picking up the receiver. But just as he dialed 911, the lights in the diner flickered. The hum of the refrigerator went silent, and for a moment, everything was still. Then, in the darkness, we heard a soft, slow tapping on the window. We bolted through the kitchen, with Carl leading the way. I glanced back just in time to see the glass shatter, and the man crawling through the window like a wild animal. Carl pushed open the back door, and we stumbled out into the alley behind the diner. Carl panted, glancing around. We need to get to the car. We sprinted down the alley, the man's footsteps echoing behind us. He was faster than I expected, his heavy breathing growing louder as he closed in on us. I could hear his raspy voice muttering something, words I couldn't quite make out. Carl reached the car, fumbling with the keys, urging me to get in quickly as the doors unlocked. I yanked the door open and jumped inside just as Carl started the engine. The headlights flicked on, illuminating the man standing at the end of the alley. Now he was covered in blood, his smile wider as he slowly raised his thumb again, rigid and grotesque, like a hitchhiker's signal. Tires screeched as Carl slammed on the gas, and the truck sped out of the alley and onto the road. I glanced into the rear-view mirror, my heart still racing. The man stood motionless at the edge of the diner, watching us disappear into the night. We didn't speak for the first few miles, both of us too stunned to process what had just happened. We drove in silence for the next hour, trying to put as much distance as possible between us and that place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. I eventually called the police to report the incident. To my surprise, they told us to head toward a location near the diner. They confirmed that a man matching that description had been reported. A man had been killed in a hit and run accident near the ramp, not far from the diner. As I got closer, I saw it. It was the same man. His body lay by the roadside, his clothes covered in dirt. But the eeriest part was his right hand, still holding that thumb up, just like before. According to the report, the man had survived the initial accident earlier that night and had been able to walk. His desperate search for help led him to our diner before he collapsed on the road. But there was more to the story. It turned out that this man had been involved in a series of violent incidents years earlier, hitchhiking across states and attacking those who picked him up. The police pieced together his history, a fugitive, infamous for attacking victims and vanishing into the night. The accident had broken his body, but it didn't kill him immediately. He had stumbled into the diner, seeking refuge, only to return to the streets, where he was eventually found dead. The police said he had been trying to use his injury to manipulate others. We were lucky to have escaped him. As I stood in the parking lot, staring at the diner, everything started to make sense. The man wasn't a ghost. He was real. Maybe he had finally paid the price in the same way he had hurt others on the road. That was where his twisted journey had come to an end.